Two 8-year-old girls, abandoned on the Wyoming prairie, left to die by the woman who promised to care for them. As coyotes circle and darkness falls, they clutch each other, believing these are their final moments. But fate has other plans. A lone cowboy appears on the horizon, a man who lost everything and swore never to open his heart again. This is the story of twin orphans left to die on the trail, until a hardened cowboy claimed them as his own. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon wheels had stopped creaking an hour ago. Ruby Lockridge knew this because she'd been counting the rotations, counting the seconds, counting anything to keep her mind off the hollow ache in her belly and the way her stepmother's eyes had turned cold as river stones that morning. Beside her in the cramped wagon bed, her twin sister Raina pressed close, their bodies thin and trembling beneath a threadbare blanket that did nothing against the autumn chill seeping through the canvas. "Ruby," Raina's whisper was barely audible over the wind. "Why did we stop?" "I don't know." Ruby squeezed her sister's hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath papery skin. They'd been on the Oregon Trail for 3 months, and every day had been harder than the last. Ever since their father died of cholera back in Missouri, their stepmother, a woman they'd known only 6 months before Pa's death, had changed. The mask of sweetness she'd worn during courtship had cracked, then shattered completely. The canvas flap jerked open with violent force. "Get out!" Eleanor Lockridge's face was drawn tight, her mouth a thin slash across weathered features. At 32, she looked 50. The trail had a way of aging people, stripping away softness until only hardness remained. "Both of you, now." "But ma'am," Ruby started. "Don't you ma'am me, girl." Eleanor's hand shot out, grabbing Ruby by the arm and hauling her toward the wagon's edge. "You're not my blood. Never were. And I've got a new husband now who don't want the burden of feeding 2 worthless mouths." Raina scrambled after her sister, clutching the torn rag doll their real mother had made before she died, giving birth to them. "Please, we'll be good. We won't eat much. We promise." The slap came so fast that Raina didn't have time to flinch. Her head snapped to the side and a thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Raina!" Ruby lunged forward, but Eleanor shoved her hard. She tumbled from the wagon, landing in the dirt with a painful thud that knocked the wind from her lungs. "Stop it!" A man's voice cut through the chaos. Ruby looked up to see Eleanor's new husband, a drifter named Silas Crane, who joined their wagon train 2 weeks ago and married Eleanor in a hasty ceremony that had scandalized the other travelers. He was leaning against a cottonwood tree, picking his teeth with a stick, watching the scene with casual indifference. "Just leave him and let's go. We're burning daylight." "Please," Ruby gasped, struggling to her feet. Dust coated her dark hair, stuck to the tears streaming down her face. "We can walk. We'll keep up. We won't be any trouble. You've been nothing but trouble since the day you were born." Eleanor grabbed Raina and threw her out of the wagon as well. The little girl landed beside her sister with a cry of pain, the rag doll flying from her hands. "Your father spoiled you rotten, filling your heads with nonsense about schools and futures. Well, here's your future, girls. The prairie. Maybe the wolves will make better use of you than I ever could." "You can't," Ruby's voice cracked. "You can't just leave us here. We're miles from anywhere. We'll die." "That's not my problem anymore." Eleanor climbed back onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. Silas swung up beside her, never once looking back at the 2 small figures in the dirt. "You want to blame someone. Blame your father for dying and leaving me with his bastards." "We're not bastards," Raina screamed, her voice raw with anguish. "Our mama and papa were married. You're lying." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Married or not, you're nothing to me now. The trail takes what it wants, and today it wants you." The whip cracked. The oxen lurched forward. And just like that, the wagon began rolling away across the prairie, churning up dust that caught in Ruby's throat and made her cough. "No!" Ruby ran after it, her bare feet bleeding on the sharp stones. "Please, don't leave us, please!" But Eleanor didn't look back. The wagon grew smaller, until it was just a dark shape on the horizon, and then it disappeared over a ridge, leaving nothing but silence and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Ruby stood frozen, her chest heaving, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Behind her, she heard Raina sobbing, deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief, from a place of pure animal terror. Slowly, Ruby turned. Raina was on her knees, clutching the rag doll, rocking back and forth. Blood still seeped from her split lip, mixing with tears and dirt, until her face was a mess of mud and pain. Raina. Ruby's voice was hollow. She walked back to her sister, every step feeling like moving through water. When she reached her twin, she dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the shaking body. It's okay. It's going to be okay. How? Raina's eyes, the same deep brown as Ruby's, the same as their father's, were wide with shock. How is it going to be okay? She left us, Ruby. She actually left us. Ruby had no answer. She was 8 years old and she'd just been abandoned on the Wyoming prairie with her twin sister, with no food, no water, no shelter, and no idea which direction led to civilization. The sun was already sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that would have been beautiful if they hadn't heralded the coming of night. Night on the prairie was a dangerous thing. We need to move, Ruby finally said, forcing strength into her voice that she didn't feel. We can't stay here. Move where? Raina looked around at the endless expanse of grass and scrub brush stretching in every direction. We don't even know where the trail is anymore. Ruby stood, pulling her sister up with her. Then we walk. We keep the setting sun on our left and we walk. Someone will find us, another wagon train maybe, or a ranch. There have to be ranches out here. What if there aren't? Raina's voice was small, frightened. What if we walk and nobody finds us? What if we die out here, Ruby? We're not going to die. Ruby said it with a fierce certainty she didn't possess, but Raina needed to hear it. They both needed to hear it. We're Lockridge girls. We're survivors. Mama survived long enough to bring us into this world, and Papa survived a war. We've got strong blood, Raina. We're going to make it. Raina nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She clutched the rag doll tighter. Promise? Ruby swallowed the lump in her throat. I promise. It was a promise she had no business making, but what else could she do? Raina was her sister, her twin, the only family she had left in the entire world. If hope was all she could give her, then she'd give it, even if it was a lie. They started walking. The prairie was deceptively flat. From a distance, it looked like you could see forever, but once you were in it, the land revealed its hidden features. Shallow gullies carved by spring runoff, clusters of sagebrush that scratched their legs, prairie dog holes that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. The grass itself was taller than it looked, sometimes reaching past their waists, and it whispered secrets in a language they couldn't understand. Ruby kept one hand locked with Raina's, terrified that if she let go, her sister would somehow vanish into the endless landscape. Their bare feet left small prints in the dust, prints that the wind immediately began erasing, as if they'd never existed at all. The sun continued its descent. Ruby, I'm thirsty, Raina said after they'd been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. I know, me too. Ruby's tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. They'd had water that morning, a single cup each, rationed from Eleanor's barrel, but that was it. We'll find a creek soon. There has to be water out here somewhere. But they didn't find a creek. They didn't find anything except more grass, more emptiness, more sky turning from blue to purple to deep, threatening indigo. Raina stumbled. Ruby caught her, but barely. She was so weak herself that they both nearly went down. I can't, Raina gasped. Ruby, I can't walk anymore. My feet. Ruby looked down and bit back a cry of dismay. Raina's feet were covered in blood, torn to shreds by the sharp stones and dried grass stems. Her own weren't much better. She'd been so focused on moving forward that she'd ignored the pain, but now it hit her all at once, a burning agony that made her want to scream. Okay, she managed. Okay, we'll rest. Just for a minute. They sank down into the grass, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ruby's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Or maybe that was just the blood rushing through her head. She felt dizzy, disconnected, like she was floating somewhere above her own body, watching two small girls huddled in the dying light. "Tell me a story," Raina whispered. "Please, tell me about Mama." Ruby's throat tightened. Their mother had died the day they were born, but their father had told them so many stories that they felt like they'd known her. "Mama had hair like midnight," Ruby began, her voice soft. "And when she laughed, it sounded like music. Papa said she could make flowers grow just by looking at them, and that she sang to you and me when we were in her belly." "What did she sing?" Raina asked. She always asked this question, and Ruby always had the same answer. "Lullabies. Sweet songs about stars and dreams and all the beautiful things waiting for us in the world." Ruby blinked back tears. "She wanted us to be happy, Raina. She wanted us to have good lives." "This isn't a good life," Raina said quietly. "Being left to die in the middle of nowhere. That's not what Mama wanted for us." "No," Ruby agreed. "It's not. But we're not dead yet, and as long as we're alive, there's still hope. That's what Papa used to say, remember? Hope is the last thing to die, girls. Hold on to it with both hands and don't let go." A distant sound cut through the twilight, a long, wavering howl that raised every hair on Ruby's body. "What was that?" Raina's fingers dug into Ruby's arm. "Just a coyote," Ruby lied, though she was fairly certain it was a wolf. "They won't bother us. We're too big." Another howl answered the first, and then another. They were closer now, circling. Ruby could feel it, could feel the presence of predators in the gathering darkness, could feel the weight of hungry eyes watching them from the shadows. "Ruby," Raina's voice was strangled with terror. "Get up!" Ruby hauled her sister to her feet, ignoring the screaming pain in her own. "We have to move now!" They ran. It wasn't really running, more of a desperate, shambling jog that sent jolts of agony through their ruined feet with every step. But it was faster than walking, and fear gave them strength they didn't know they possessed. The howls grew louder, more excited, and Ruby's imagination conjured shapes in the gloom, lean bodies, gleaming teeth, eyes that reflected the last light of day. "I see something," Raina gasped. "Ruby, look! There!" Ruby squinted through the darkness and felt a sob of relief catch in her chest. Ahead, maybe 100 yards away, was a rocky outcrop. Not much, just a cluster of boulders jutting up from the prairie, but it was something. Defensible. A place where they could put their backs against stone instead of being exposed on all sides. They crashed into the rocks with the last of their energy, scrambling up and wedging themselves into a narrow crevice between two large boulders. Ruby pulled Raina close, both of them breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. The first wolf appeared at the base of the rocks. It was bigger than Ruby had imagined, nearly as large as the oxen that had pulled Eleanor's wagon, with gray fur and eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. It paced back and forth, its head low, assessing, testing. Another joined it, then another. "Ruby!" Raina was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. "What do we do?" "We stay here," Ruby said, trying to sound calm even though terror was clawing at her insides. "They can't reach us up here. We're safe. We just have to wait them out." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. The crevice would protect them from the wolves, but what about the cold? The temperature was already dropping fast. She could see her breath misting in the air, and they had nothing but their thin, dirty dresses to keep them warm. Even if they survived the night, what about tomorrow? They'd be even weaker then, even more dehydrated. How long could two 8-year-old girls last without food or water? "I'm scared," Raina whispered. "I'm so scared, Ruby." "I know." Ruby held her sister tighter, resting her cheek against Raina's hair. "I'm scared too. But we have each other, right? We always have each other." "Always," Raina agreed, her voice small but fierce. "Forever and ever." "Forever and ever," Ruby repeated, and she let her eyes drift closed, just for a moment. She was so tired, so incredibly, impossibly tired. Maybe if she just rested for a minute, just closed her eyes and... "Ruby, don't fall asleep." Raina shook her. "You can't fall asleep. If you sleep, you might not wake up." Ruby forced her eyes open, though it felt like lifting enormous weights. "I won't. I promise. I'm just resting my eyes." But the truth was, she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. The darkness was seductive, calling to her, promising an end to the pain and fear. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting, to sink down into the nothing and never have to hurt again. She felt Raina slump against her, felt her sister's breathing begin to slow and deepen. Raina? Raina, stay awake. But Ruby's own voice sounded far away, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The wolves continued to pace at the base of the rocks, their shadows merging with the darkness, until Ruby couldn't tell where the animals ended and the night began. She tried to stay alert, tried to keep watch, but her eyelids were so heavy, and her body was so cold, and somewhere in the distance she thought she heard singing. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Was that Mama? Had Mama come to get them? That would be nice. That would be... A sound jerked her back to consciousness. Not a wolf. Something else. Something bigger. Ruby's eyes snapped open. She couldn't see anything except darkness and stars, but she could hear the steady rhythm of hoofbeats growing closer. Her heart leaped with hope so intense it was painful. Someone's coming, she croaked, shaking Raina. Wake up! Someone's coming! Raina stirred but didn't wake. Her skin felt cold, too cold. Help! Ruby's voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Help! We're up here! Please! The hoofbeats stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence and the sound of the wolves growling. Then a voice, deep, rough, unmistakably male, cut through the night. What in the hell? Ruby heard a metallic click, and then a thunderous bang split the air. One of the wolves yelped and scrambled away. Another shot rang out, and the rest of the pack scattered, disappearing into the darkness like smoke. Who's there? The voice called. Show yourself. Up here, Ruby managed. In the rocks. Please, help us. She heard boots on stone, saw the beam of a lantern swinging wildly as someone climbed toward them. Then the light hit her face, and she had to squeeze her eyes shut against the sudden brightness. Sweet Jesus. The voice was closer now, filled with something Ruby couldn't quite identify. Horror? Disbelief? You're just kids. What are you doing out here? Ruby opened her eyes slowly, letting them adjust. The man holding the lantern was tall, or at least he seemed tall from her position curled in the crevice. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could see his eyes, and they were the color of winter storms. Our stepmother, Ruby rasped. She left us, hours ago. Told us the trail could have us. The man went very still. She left you? Out here? Alone? Ruby nodded. She wanted to say more, wanted to explain everything, but her voice had given out. Beside her, Raina was unconscious, barely breathing. The man set down his lantern and climbed up into the crevice with them. Up close, Ruby could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 30, with dark hair and a face carved from hard living. His hands were scarred, his jaw rough with stubble. But when he touched Raina's forehead, his fingers were surprisingly gentle. She's hypothermic, he muttered. Both of you are half frozen. How long have you been out here? Since afternoon, Ruby managed. We walked, then we ran. The wolves came and... Her voice broke. Please don't leave us. Please. I know we're not worth much, but we can work. We can earn our keep. Just please don't... Easy now. The man's voice softened. I'm not leaving anyone, especially not two little girls in the middle of the prairie. He scooped Raina into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing. Can you walk? Ruby tried to stand and immediately collapsed. Her legs simply wouldn't hold her anymore. Without a word, the man settled Raina carefully over one shoulder and reached for Ruby with his free arm. Come on then, let's get you both somewhere warm. He carried them down from the rocks and over to where a massive black stallion waited. The horse was enormous, snorting vapor into the cold air, but it stood perfectly still as the man draped both girls across the saddle. Easy, Midnight, he murmured to the horse. I know they're extra weight, but we're not leaving them. He swung up behind them, one arm securing them both against his chest. Hold on if you can. My ranch isn't far. Ruby tried to hold on, but she had no strength left. She felt herself slipping, felt consciousness starting to fade again, and this time she didn't fight it. The man was real. Help was real. They were going to survive. As darkness claimed her, she heard him speaking quietly. Don't you die on me, girls. Not tonight. You've already fought too hard to give up now. The horse began to move, smooth and fast, and Ruby let herself fall into the void, trusting, for the first time in months, that someone would catch her. When Ruby woke, she thought she'd died and gone to heaven. She was warm. That was the first thing she registered. Real warmth, not the weak comfort of thin blankets or the false heat of fever, but actual luxurious warmth that soaked into her bones and made her want to weep with relief. The second thing was the softness beneath her. She was lying on something that felt like a cloud, something that cradled her aching body with a gentleness she'd almost forgotten existed. The third thing was the smell. Bread. Someone was baking bread. Ruby's eyes fluttered open. She was in a bedroom, a real bedroom with wooden walls and a ceiling made of solid beams, not canvas flapping in the wind. The bed she lay in was enormous, piled high with quilts and pillows, and beside her, Raina! Ruby sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it. The room spun, and her head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. Easy, mija, a woman's voice, warm and accented. Your sister is right here. She's still sleeping, but she's safe. Ruby turned to see a woman sitting in a chair between the two beds. She was perhaps 50, with silver threading through her dark hair and warm brown skin that crinkled around her eyes. She wore a simple dress and an apron, and her hands were folded calmly in her lap. Where? Ruby's voice came out as a croak. Where are we? The Hayes Ranch. The woman stood and poured water from a pitcher into a glass. Drink this, slowly. Your stomach needs to remember what water is. Ruby took the glass with shaking hands and brought it to her lips. The water was cool and clean and tasted like the most wonderful thing she'd ever experienced. She wanted to gulp it down, to drain the entire glass. But the woman's warning made her sip carefully. I'm Evelina Reyes, the woman continued. I'm the housekeeper here. You and your sister have been asleep for almost 24 hours. 24 hours? Ruby's eyes widened. But we can't. We have to... She tried to get out of bed and found her legs wouldn't cooperate. They were wrapped in bandages, she realized. So were her hands. You have to rest, Evelina said firmly. Your feet were torn to ribbons, child. You won't be walking for a few days yet. And your sister... Her expression softened. Your sister was in bad shape. Hypothermia, dehydration, malnutrition. Mr. Hayes rode through the night to fetch Dr. Morrison from town. She's going to be all right, but it was close. Ruby's chest tightened. She looked at Raina lying in the next bed, looking so small and pale against the white sheets, but her chest was rising and falling steadily, and that was what mattered. She was alive. Mr. Hayes? Ruby looked back at Evelina. That's the man who found us? Coulter Hayes, yes, he owns this ranch. Evelina moved to the window and pulled back the curtain, letting in morning light. 5,000 acres, more than 200 head of cattle, dozens of horses. He's one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Ruby didn't care if he was the richest man in the world. He'd saved their lives. That was all that mattered. Is he... She hesitated. Is he going to make us leave? When we're better? Evelina's expression was unreadable. That's a question for Mr. Hayes, but I can tell you this, he hasn't left this house since he brought you here. He's been pacing the hallway outside this room like a caged wolf. Before Ruby could process that, there was a knock on the door. Come in, Evelina called. The door opened, and the man from the rocks entered. He looked different in daylight, still tall, still rough around the edges, but younger than Ruby had thought. His eyes were indeed gray, like storm clouds, and there were lines around them that suggested he'd seen things he'd rather forget. He'd shaved and changed into clean clothes, but there was an exhaustion in his bearing that spoke of a sleepless night. She's awake, he said, and his voice held a note of relief. I am, Ruby confirmed. She felt oddly shy under his gaze. Thank you for saving us. If you hadn't come, don't think about that. Coulter moved into the room, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his eyes never leaving her face. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Who left you out there? Ruby's hands clenched around the water glass. The memory of Eleanor's cold eyes, of Silas's indifferent smirk, of the wagon rolling away into the distance. It was almost too much. But this man had saved them. He deserved the truth. So she told him everything. She told him about their father dying of cholera in Missouri, about Eleanor, who'd married their father 6 months before his death and had seemed kind until the moment she didn't need to pretend anymore, about the months on the trail with less and less food, more and more chores, while Eleanor's affection curdled into resentment, about Silas Crane joining the wagon train, about the hasty wedding, about Eleanor telling them that morning that she was tired of feeding useless mouths. She said, Ruby's voice cracked, she said maybe the wolves would make better use of us than she ever could. Then she just left, drove away, and didn't look back. By the time she finished, Coulter's jaw was so tight it looked like it might crack. His hands were gripping the arms of the chair with enough force to turn his knuckles white. What's her full name? His voice was dangerously quiet. Eleanor Lockridge, but she's Eleanor Crane now, I guess, and her husband is Silas Crane. They were with the Harrison wagon train, at least that's what Papa said when we joined up. The Harrison train. Coulter stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. That train passed through here 3 days ago. They camped by Two Rivers Creek before heading north toward Fort Laramie. He looked at Evelina. Send Jericho to town. I want the marshal. And I want a lawyer. Nobody abandons children on my land and gets away with it. Mr. Hayes, Ruby's voice was small. What if she comes back for us? What if she... Then she'll have to go through me first. Coulter's eyes met hers, and Ruby saw something in them that made her believe him. This was a man who didn't make empty promises. You and your sister are under my protection now. Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Understood? Ruby nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes. She didn't understand why the stranger was being so kind to them, why he cared at all about 2 orphaned girls he'd found in the dark. But she was grateful, so desperately grateful. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Why are you helping us? Coulter went very still. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Ruby thought maybe she'd overstepped. Then he spoke, his voice rough. Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and because... He paused, his throat working. Because nobody should die alone on the prairie, especially not children. There was a weight to his words, a history Ruby didn't understand. But before she could ask, Raina stirred in the next bed. Ruby? Raina's voice was weak, confused. Where are we? We're safe, Ruby answered, relief flooding through her. We're at a ranch, and this is Mr. Hayes. He's the one who found us, remember? Raina blinked slowly, focusing on Coulter, her eyes, so like Ruby's, dark and wide, filled with tears. You saved us from the wolves. I did, Coulter confirmed. He moved to Raina's bedside, and his expression softened in a way Ruby wouldn't have thought possible. How are you feeling? Tired, and my throat hurts, and Raina looked around the room, her confusion deepening. This is a real house. We're in a real house. You are. Evelina came forward with another glass of water. And you're going to stay here as long as you need to. Now drink this slowly, and then I'll bring you both some broth. Broth? Raina's eyes widened. Real food? Real food, Evelina promised. Though we'll start small. Your bodies need time to adjust. As Evelina helped Raina drink, Ruby watched Coulter. He'd stepped back, giving them space, but he was still watching them with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. There was something in his eyes, a pain, a longing, that Ruby didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. This man had lost something, someone, and somehow finding them had opened an old wound. Over the next 3 days, Ruby and Raina slowly recovered. Evelina was a constant presence, bringing them small meals, changing their bandages, telling them stories about the ranch and its owner. Dr. Morrison came twice a day to check on them, his weathered face crinkling into smiles when he saw their improvement. Remarkable resilience, he told Coulter on the 3rd evening, after examining both girls. Most children wouldn't have survived what they went through, but these 2 are fighters. Another few days of rest and good food, and they'll be strong enough to move around. Coulter, who'd been present for every examination, nodded silently. Ruby learned things during those days. She learned that the Hayes Ranch was indeed massive, sprawling across miles of Wyoming territory. She learned that Coulter ran it with a small crew of loyal ranch hands who'd been with him for years. She learned that Evelina had come to the ranch 5 years ago, after her own husband died, and had been running the household ever since. What she didn't learn was why Coulter Hayes, a wealthy rancher who could have left two orphaned girls to their fate, had instead brought them into his home. On the fourth morning, Ruby was finally strong enough to sit in a chair by the window. Evelina had helped her wash and had given her a clean dress, a simple cotton thing that was too big but felt like luxury after months in filthy rags. Raina sat in the chair beside her, looking out at the ranch with wide, wondering eyes. "Look at all the horses," Raina breathed. "Ruby, there must be 100 horses." 28 in the near pasture," a voice said from the doorway. "Couple hundred more scattered across the property." Both girls turned to see Coulter standing there, his shoulder against the doorframe. He looked less haggard today. He'd apparently finally gotten some sleep, but there was still a tension in his bearing, like a string pulled too tight. "Mr. Hayes," Ruby said, "we wanted to thank you properly for everything. We don't have any money, but when we're better, we can work. We can help with chores or cooking or—" "You're 8 years old," Coulter interrupted. "You should be in school, not working." "There isn't any school," Raina said quietly. "Not on the trail. Pa was teaching us, but then he died, and Eleanor—" She stopped, her face clouding. "Eleanor won't be a problem." Coulter pushed off from the doorframe and entered the room. "The marshal tracked down the Harrison train yesterday. He questioned the wagon master and several other travelers. They all confirmed your story, said they saw Eleanor push you out of the wagon and drive off. Said they tried to intervene, but Silas Crane pulled a gun and told them to mind their own business." Ruby felt her stomach knot. "What happens now?" "Now?" Coulter's smile was cold. "Now Eleanor and Silas are being held in the territorial jail pending charges of child abandonment and endangerment. They'll stand trial next month. And given the testimony against them, they'll be going to prison for a very long time." Raina's hand found Ruby's and squeezed tight. "They can't take us back?" "No," Coulter said firmly. "They can't. The marshal has already started proceedings to terminate Eleanor's custodial rights. As for what happens to you after that—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with something. Ruby watched him, saw the war playing out on his face, and suddenly she understood. This man was terrified. Not of them, but of himself. Of whatever he was about to say next. "I want you to stay here," he finally said. "Both of you, permanently. If you want to, that is. No one will force you, but this ranch is big enough for 2 more, and Evelina's been saying for years that the house is too quiet. So if you'd be willing—" "Yes," Ruby said immediately. Beside her, Raina was nodding so hard her head looked like it might fall off. Coulter blinked, clearly surprised by the quick acceptance. "You don't want time to think about it?" "No," Raina said. "We want to stay. Please let us stay." Something shifted in Coulter's expression. A crack in the armor he wore. A glimpse of the vulnerable man beneath. "All right then, we'll make it official once you're well enough to speak with the judge. In the meantime—" He cleared his throat roughly. "In the meantime, welcome home." The word hung in the air. Home. And Ruby felt something break open in her chest. They had a home. After months of uncertainty, of fear, of believing they'd die on the trail like so many others, they had a home. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Coulter," he corrected. "If you're going to live here, you can call me Coulter, or—" He paused, looking uncertain. "Or whatever feels right to you." Ruby understood what he wasn't saying. He was offering them more than a place to live. He was offering them a family, or the beginning of one, anyway. Over the following weeks, as Ruby and Raina grew stronger, they began to explore their new home. The ranch house was enormous, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with more rooms than they could count. Evelina showed them around, pointing out the kitchen where she created magic with cast iron and spices, the library where Coulter kept hundreds of books, the parlor with its massive fireplace. "Mr. Hayes doesn't use most of these rooms," Evelina explained as they walked through yet another empty bedroom. "The house was built for a family, but after—" She stopped herself. "Well, it's been quiet for a long time." "After what?" Ruby asked. Evelina looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. It's not my story to tell, mija. But you should know that Mr. Hayes is a good man who suffered a great loss. Be patient with him. He's trying. Ruby wanted to ask more, but Reina tugged on her hand, pulling her toward the window. Look! Someone's teaching horses in the ring! They both pressed their faces to the glass, watching as one of the ranch hands worked with a young bay gelding. The horse was fighting the saddle, bucking and spinning, but the cowboy stayed mounted, his movements fluid and practiced. That's Jericho, Evelina said. He's been with Mr. Hayes since the beginning. He's the foreman, runs the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Can we go watch? Reina asked eagerly. Tomorrow, Evelina promised. Today you're still recovering, but tomorrow I'll take you down to the corrals and you can meet the hands. They're rough men, but good ones. They'll look after you. True to her word, the next morning Evelina bundled both girls into warm coats, borrowed from the general store in town, paid for by Coulter, and led them down to the working part of the ranch. The corrals were bustling with activity, cowboys moving cattle, training horses, repairing fences. The air smelled of hay and leather and honest sweat. Miss Evelina, one of the hands tipped his hat. These the girls the boss found? They are, Evelina confirmed. Girls, this is Cal Brennan. He's in charge of the cattle operation. Cal was young, maybe 20, with sandy hair and a quick smile. Pleased to meet you, ladies. Heard you gave those wolves quite a scare. They scared us more, Reina admitted. I'll bet. Cal crouched down to their level. Well, you don't have to worry about wolves anymore. We shoot 'em on sight around here. This is safe land now. As they continued through the ranch, more hands introduced themselves. There was Jericho, tall, dark-skinned, with hands that could gentle the wildest horse. Marcus, the oldest of the crew, who'd been a soldier before turning rancher. Young Tommy, barely 16, who'd lost his family to typhoid and found a new one at the Hayes Ranch. They all welcomed the girls with easy warmth, treating them like they belonged there, like they'd always belonged there. But it was when Coulter appeared in the barn that afternoon that something shifted. Ruby and Reina were sitting on hay bales, watching Jericho work with a horse, when they heard boots on wood. Coulter emerged from the shadows, leading a gray mare that Ruby recognized from the pasture. Her name is Silver, Coulter said without preamble. She's 15 years old, gentle as a lamb, and patient with beginners. I thought, if you girls wanted to learn to ride, she'd be a good horse to start with. Ruby felt her heart stutter. You want to teach us? If you'd like. Coulter's expression was carefully neutral, but Ruby could see hope lurking in his eyes. Every person on this ranch knows how to ride. Seemed like you should too. Yes, Reina breathed. Oh yes, please. And so began their first real lesson with Coulter Hayes. He was a patient teacher, Ruby discovered. Firm but kind, never raising his voice, always demonstrating before expecting them to try. He showed them how to approach a horse, how to read its body language, how to run a hand down its neck to check for tension. He taught them about tack, saddles and bridles, bits and reins, explaining each piece with a thoroughness that suggested he'd done this before. You had someone else you taught, Ruby said suddenly. Didn't you? Coulter's hands stilled on the saddle. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said quietly, My wife, Sarah. I taught her to ride when we first married. She'd grown up in Boston, never been near a horse in her life. But she learned. She was... His voice caught. She was fearless. What happened to her? Reina asked, her voice soft. Coulter's jaw worked. She died 5 years ago. Childbirth. The baby, our daughter, she lived for 3 days and then he couldn't finish, didn't need to. Ruby's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. So am I. Coulter took a shaky breath and forced himself to continue working. But life goes on whether we want it to or not. Sarah would have wanted me to keep living, to find joy again, if I could. I think... He glanced at both girls, and his expression was raw. I think she would have liked you too. We would have liked her too, Ruby said softly. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection forged in shared grief. They'd all lost people. They all knew what it was like to have love ripped away. But they were still here, still surviving. and maybe that counted for something. The riding lessons became a daily ritual. Every morning, Coulter would meet the girls in the barn, and they'd work with Silver for an hour or two. Ruby took to it naturally. She'd always been good with animals, but Raina struggled at first, nervous about the size of the horses and the height of the saddle. "I've got you," Coulter assured her the first time she froze up, staring at the stirrup like it was a mile above the ground. "I won't let you fall, trust me." And somehow, Raina did. She let Coulter boost her into the saddle, let him adjust her seat and her grip on the reins, let him lead Silver in slow circles around the corral while she found her balance. By the end of that first week, she was smiling. By the end of the second, she was asking to go faster. "Look at you," Coulter said, pride clear in his voice. "You're a natural." "Ruby's better," Raina protested, but she was grinning. "You're both doing great," Coulter corrected. "And tomorrow, if you're ready, we'll try trotting." Life at the ranch fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for riding lessons. Afternoons were for lessons of a different kind. Evelina had dug out old school books and was teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic at the kitchen table. Evenings were for dinner with Coulter and Evelina, and then sitting by the fire while someone read aloud. It was during one of these evenings, 3 weeks after they had arrived at the ranch, that everything changed. They were in the parlor, Ruby and Raina curled up on the sofa, Coulter in his chair, Evelina knitting in the corner, when there was a violent pounding on the front door. Coulter was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he ordered. But Ruby's instincts were screaming danger. She grabbed Raina's hand and held tight, her heart racing. The pounding came again, followed by a woman's voice. "Open this door! I know those brats are in there!" Ruby's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Eleanor. Coulter yanked open the door, and there she stood, Eleanor Crane, looking wild and desperate, with Silas hulking behind her. She'd lost weight since Ruby had last seen her, and there was a manic gleam in her eyes that made Ruby's skin crawl. "Where are they?" Eleanor demanded. "Where are my daughters?" "They're not your daughters," Coulter said coldly, "and you're trespassing on private property. You've got 5 seconds to leave before I have my men throw you off." "Those girls belong to me," Eleanor shrieked. "I'm their mother." "You're the woman who tried to murder them," Coulter interrupted. "And last I heard, you were supposed to be in jail awaiting trial. How did you—" "Silas posted bail," Eleanor spat, "and we came straight here to get what's ours. Those girls can earn money, good money, if we take them to the mining camps. Men pay well for—" Coulter hit Silas so hard the man's head snapped back and he crumpled to the porch. Then he grabbed Eleanor by the front of her dress and lifted her off her feet. "If you ever," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "come near those children again, I will end you. Do you understand me? I don't care about laws or trials or what some judge says. You tried to kill them once. You won't get a second chance." "You can't keep them," Eleanor was screaming now, clawing at his hands. "They're mine. I have rights." "You have nothing." Coulter threw her down beside her unconscious husband. "Jericho!" The foreman appeared from the bunkhouse, followed by 6 ranch hands. "Boss?" "Escort these 2 off my property. If they resist, tie them to their horses, and send someone to town for the marshal. They've violated their bail." "You'll regret this," Eleanor shrieked as Jericho hauled her to her feet. "Those girls are cursed. They killed their own mother. They'll bring nothing but death and misery to this house." Ruby flinched as if she'd been struck. Beside her, Raina had started crying. Coulter turned and saw them standing in the doorway, pale and terrified. His expression softened immediately. "Don't listen to her," he said firmly. "She's just trying to hurt you because she knows she's lost." But the damage was done. Ruby could feel it. That old, familiar shame creeping back in, the voice in her head that whispered maybe Eleanor's right. Maybe we are cursed. Maybe everyone we love dies. Evelina ushered them back inside while Coulter dealt with Eleanor and Silas. By the time he came back in, both girls were huddled on the sofa, silent and shaking. "They're gone," Coulter announced. "The marshal's on his way. They won't bother you again." But Ruby couldn't shake the sound of Eleanor's voice. Cursed, death and misery. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, maybe it would be better if we left. If we went somewhere else. We don't want to bring you bad luck or—" "Stop." Coulter knelt in front of them, his eyes intense. I don't believe in curses, and I don't believe you're bad luck. What I believe is that you're two brave girls who've survived more than most adults could handle. What I believe is that you deserve a chance at a real life. And what I believe, he paused, his throat working, what I believe is that you've already brought more life into this house than it's had in 5 years. But your wife, Raina said. Your baby. They died and now we're here. And what if... They died because of an infection, Coulter said gently. Not because of anything you did or didn't do. Not because of a curse. Just because sometimes terrible things happen to good people. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. That doesn't mean we give up on the chance for happiness. He reached out and took both their hands. His palms were rough and scarred, but his grip was steady. I want you to stay, he said quietly. Not because I feel obligated, not because I pity you, but because in the last 3 weeks you've reminded me what it feels like to have a purpose, to have people to care for, to have, his voice cracked, to have a family again. Ruby felt tears streaming down her face. You really want us? I really want you, Coulter confirmed. Both of you. For as long as you'll have me. Raina threw herself at him, wrapping her thin arms around his neck and sobbing. Ruby followed a moment later, and Coulter gathered them both close, holding them like they were the most precious things in the world. And maybe, Ruby thought, they were. Maybe this broken cowboy and 2 orphaned girls could build something new from the ashes of their grief. Maybe they could be a family, not born of blood, but forged in fire and choice, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Thank you, Ruby whispered against his shoulder. Thank you for not riding away. Coulter's arms tightened around them. Thank you, he said softly, for giving me a reason to stop. Behind them, Evelina dabbed at her eyes with her apron and smiled. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the prairie, cold and endless. But inside the Hayes Ranch, in a parlor lit by firelight, 3 people who'd been lost found themselves again in each other. And that, Ruby thought, was worth more than all the gold in California. The marshal arrived at dawn, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the situation. Eleanor and Silas had been caught trying to steal horses from the Hayes Ranch stable, a desperate attempt to flee before the law caught up with them. Now they sat in the back of his wagon, hands bound, while Coulter stood on the porch with his arms crossed. They posted bail with stolen money, Marshal Dixon explained, his voice carrying across the yard where Ruby and Raina watched from the window. Robbed a supply wagon 2 days after they got out. We've been tracking them ever since. Good riddance, Coulter muttered. How long this time? Judge Carmichael's talking 10 years minimum. Abandonment, theft, attempted kidnapping. They've racked up quite a list. Dixon tipped his hat. Those girls are lucky you found them when you did, Hayes. Another few hours and... I know. Coulter's jaw tightened. Believe me, I know. As the marshal's wagon disappeared down the long drive, Coulter turned and found both girls standing in the doorway, still in their nightgowns, their faces pale in the early morning light. It's over, he said simply. They can't hurt you anymore. But Ruby could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept drifting to his gun belt. He was worried about something, and that worry made her stomach knot with anxiety. What's wrong? She asked. Coulter hesitated, then gestured for them to come outside. They stepped onto the porch, the morning air crisp and cold, and he knelt down so he was at their eye level. The trial's been moved up, he said carefully. Judge Carmichael wants to settle the custody situation before Eleanor goes to prison. He's asked that you both come to town tomorrow to testify. Raina's hand found Ruby's and squeezed tight. Testify? Tell the judge what happened, Coulter explained. About how Eleanor abandoned you, about what she said, about... He paused. About whether you want to stay here. With me. Of course we want to stay, Ruby said immediately. We told you that. I know, but the judge needs to hear it officially, and there's something else. Coulter took a deep breath. Evelina and I have been talking about making this arrangement permanent, about adopting you both. The word hung in the air like something fragile and precious. Adoption. A real family. Not just a place to live, but belonging, legal, unbreakable, permanent. You want to adopt us? Raina's voice was barely a whisper. "If you'll have me," Coulter said, and there was vulnerability in his eyes that made Ruby's chest ache. "I know I'm not your father. I know I can't replace him, but I can promise you a home and safety and love. If you'll let me." Ruby felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, we want that. We want you." Coulter pulled them both into his arms, and for a long moment they just stood there on the porch, holding each other as the sun rose over the Wyoming prairie. When they finally pulled apart, Coulter's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Then we better get ready for court," he said, his voice rough. "Evelina's already got dresses made for you both. We're going to do this properly." The next morning, they rode into town in Coulter's best carriage, a vehicle that rarely saw use but was polished to a shine for the occasion. Ruby and Raina wore new dresses of soft blue cotton, their hair brushed and braided by Evelina's careful hands. Coulter had put on his finest suit, looking every inch the wealthy rancher he was, though Ruby could see the nervousness in the set of his shoulders. "It'll be all right," Evelina said from her seat across from them. She'd insisted on coming along, had spent the previous night making sure every detail was perfect. "Judge Carmichael is a fair man. He'll see what's right." The courthouse was packed. Ruby hadn't expected so many people, townspeople she'd never met, ranch hands from neighboring properties, even some of the travelers from the wagon train who'd stayed in the area. They all stood as Coulter led the girls inside, their faces sympathetic, curious, some openly hostile as Eleanor and Silas were brought in wearing chains. Eleanor looked worse than she had that night on the porch. Her hair was matted, her dress filthy, and there was a wild desperation in her eyes that made Ruby instinctively press closer to Coulter's side. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Nathaniel Carmichael," the bailiff called. The judge was an older man with steel-gray hair and keen eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. He surveyed the courtroom with a stern expression, then gestured for everyone to sit. "We're here today," he began, "to address two matters. First, the criminal charges against Eleanor Crane and Silas Crane. Second, the custody and potential adoption of Ruby and Raina Lockridge." His gaze settled on the twins. "This court understands these are difficult proceedings, especially for young children. We'll do our best to make this as brief as possible." The prosecutor stood, a thin man named Warren, who'd traveled from Cheyenne specifically for this case. "Your Honor, the facts of this case are straightforward. On October 15th, Eleanor Crane willfully abandoned two 8-year-old girls in the middle of the Wyoming prairie, knowing full well they had no food, water, or shelter. Multiple witnesses from the Harrison wagon train saw the abandonment occur. He called witness after witness. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Horace, testified that he'd confronted Eleanor about the girls, but had been threatened by Silas's gun. A woman named Martha Simmons, another traveler, described hearing Eleanor say she was tired of feeding useless mouths. A teenage boy testified that he'd wanted to go back for the girls, but his parents had been too afraid of Silas to intervene. Through it all, Eleanor sat silent, her face a mask of rage. But when the prosecutor finished and Eleanor's court-appointed lawyer stood to cross-examine, she couldn't contain herself. "They're lying!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "Those girls were nothing but trouble. Always crying, always hungry, always needing something. Their father left me with nothing, no money, no prospects, and expected me to care for his brats." "Mrs. Crane, sit down," Judge Carmichael ordered. "I won't. Those girls killed their mother. They're cursed. Anyone who takes them in will—" The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. "Mrs. Crane, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from these proceedings. Do you understand?" Eleanor's lawyer pulled her back into her seat, whispering urgently in her ear. She subsided, but Ruby could see her hands clenching and unclenching, could see the hatred burning in her eyes. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "given Mrs. Crane's clear animosity toward the children, and given the severity of her actions, the territory requests that her parental rights be permanently terminated." Judge Carmichael nodded slowly. "Before I make that determination, I'd like to hear from the girls themselves." He looked directly at Ruby. "Miss Lockridge, would you and your sister be willing to approach the bench?" Ruby's heart hammered as she stood. Coulter's hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture of support. and then she was walking forward with Raina at her side. The courtroom felt enormous, every eye upon them, but she kept her chin up the way Papa had taught her. Lockridge girls didn't cower. Judge Carmichael's expression softened as they approached. "Hello, girls. I know this is frightening, but I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Ruby said. "Good. Now, I want you to tell me, in your own words, what happened on October 15th. Ruby took a deep breath and began. She told him everything, how Eleanor had woken them that morning with cold eyes and harsh words, how she'd shoved them from the wagon, how Silas had laughed as they cried and begged. She described the long walk through the prairie, the terror of the approaching night, the wolves circling their refuge in the rocks. "She said the trail could have us," Ruby finished, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. "She said maybe the wolves would make better use of us." Then she drove away and never looked back. "And did she provide you with any food or water before abandoning you?" Judge Carmichael asked gently. "No, sir. We hadn't eaten since the morning before, and we only had 1 cup of water that day." The judge turned to Raina. "Is this account accurate, Miss Raina?" Raina nodded, her voice small. "She also hit me, right before she pushed me out. She said we weren't her blood, and she didn't want us anymore." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Carmichael's jaw tightened, and he looked at Eleanor with barely concealed disgust. "Mrs. Crane, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Eleanor stood again, but this time her lawyer kept a firm hand on her arm. "Your Honor, my client was under extreme duress. The death of her husband, the hardships of the trail. I've heard enough," Judge Carmichael interrupted. "This court finds Eleanor Crane guilty of child abandonment and endangerment. Combined with the additional charges of theft and attempted kidnapping, I hereby sentence you to 12 years in the territorial prison." His gavel came down. "Furthermore, your parental rights to Ruby and Raina Lockridge are permanently and irrevocably terminated. You are no longer their guardian in any legal capacity." Eleanor's shriek of rage was cut short as the bailiff hauled her from the courtroom. Silas, who'd remained silent throughout, went with her, his face blank and defeated. Judge Carmichael waited until they were gone, then turned back to Ruby and Raina. "Now, as to the matter of your future, Mr. Hayes has petitioned this court for custody with the intent to adopt. Mr. Hayes, please approach." Coulter stood and walked forward, and something in Ruby's chest loosened when he took up position beside them. He didn't touch them. This was a formal proceeding, but his presence was solid and reassuring. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, "you're a wealthy man with a successful ranch. You could easily hire staff to care for these children without taking on the legal responsibilities of parenthood. Why are you pursuing adoption?" Coulter was quiet for a moment, and Ruby could see him choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, 5 years ago I lost my wife and daughter. For a long time after that, I was just existing, going through the motions. The ranch kept running because I had good people working for me, but I'd lost any real purpose." He glanced down at the girls, and his expression softened. "Then I found Ruby and Raina in the dark, nearly frozen, terrified, but still fighting to survive. They reminded me what courage looks like, what hope looks like, and over the past month, watching them heal, watching them learn to trust again, they've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. They've given me a reason to care about tomorrow." His voice roughened. "I'm not doing this out of obligation or pity. I'm doing this because they've already become part of my family. Because when I think about the future now, I see them in it. Because," he stopped, cleared his throat, "because I love them. And if this court grants me the privilege, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure they know they're wanted, valued, and cherished." Ruby felt fresh tears streaming down her face. Beside her, Raina was openly sobbing. Judge Carmichael studied Coulter for a long moment, then looked back at the girls. "And you two, do you wish to be adopted by Mr. Hayes?" "Yes," Ruby said firmly, "more than anything." "Yes," Raina echoed. "Please, Your Honor. He saved our lives. He gave us a home. We want to be his daughters." The judge's stern expression finally cracked, revealing something almost like tenderness. "Well then, This court finds that Coulter Hayes is a fit and proper guardian, and that adoption is in the best interests of the children. The adoption is hereby approved. His gavel came down one final time. Congratulations, Mr. Hayes. You have 2 daughters. Ruby and Raina Hayes, welcome to your new family. The courtroom erupted in applause. Ruby felt Coulter's arms come around both of them, felt him pull them close, and she buried her face in his shoulder and cried. Not from sadness this time, but from relief, from joy, from the overwhelming knowledge that they were finally, truly safe. When they finally emerged from the courthouse, Evelina was waiting with red eyes and a trembling smile. "Let me see them," she demanded. "Let me see my girls." Ruby and Raina ran to her, and she caught them both in a fierce embrace. "My beautiful girls," she murmured. "My brave, strong, beautiful girls, welcome home." The ride back to the ranch was different from the ride in. Ruby sat pressed against Coulter's side while Raina dozed in Evelina's arms, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day. The Wyoming landscape rolled past the carriage windows, endless prairie giving way to the foothills, then to the familiar sight of Hayes Ranch rising in the distance. "It's really ours," Ruby whispered. "We really get to stay." Big Coulter's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You really get to stay. Forever, if you want it." "We want it," Ruby said firmly. Then, hesitantly, Can we call you Papa? Or is that—" Coulter's breath caught. "You can call me whatever feels right to you. Papa, Father, Coulter, it doesn't matter to me as long as you're here." Ruby thought about it, testing the word in her mind. Papa. It felt right. Not a replacement for the father they'd lost, but a new beginning. A different kind of love, but love nonetheless. "Papa," she said softly, and watched his eyes shine with unshed tears. The ranch hands had organized a celebration. When the carriage pulled up to the house, Ruby saw streamers hung from the porch rails, saw tables laden with food, saw all the cowboys and their families gathered in the yard. Jericho stepped forward first, a rare smile on his usually serious face. "Welcome home, Miss Ruby, Miss Raina," he said formally. Then with a wink, "Reckon you'll be wanting riding lessons on something faster than old Silver now that you're official Hayes girls." "Tomorrow," Coulter said, but he was smiling. "Tonight, we celebrate." The party lasted well into the evening. Ruby and Raina were passed from person to person, receiving congratulations and well wishes from people they were just beginning to know. Cal Brennan taught them a silly dance that had them giggling helplessly. Marcus told them stories about Coulter's early days on the ranch before he'd become the serious, quiet man they knew. Young Tommy shyly presented them with a pair of carved wooden horses he'd made himself. "For your room," he explained. "Every cowboy needs a good horse, even if it's just for decoration." As the sun set and lanterns were lit across the yard, Ruby found herself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching it all with a sense of wonder. A month ago, she'd been certain she was going to die on the prairie. Now she was here, surrounded by people who cared, with a home and a family and a future stretching out before her. Thinking deep thoughts? Coulter appeared at her elbow, 2 cups of cider in his hands. He offered her one. "Just thinking how much things have changed," Ruby admitted. She took a sip of the cider, sweet and spiced, warming her from the inside. "A month ago, I thought my life was over. Now it's just beginning," Coulter finished. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want you to know something, Ruby. What I said in court about you and Raina giving me purpose, I meant every word. You've brought life back into this house, into me." Ruby looked up at him, this man who'd become her father in such a short time. "You saved us. We'd be dead if not for you." "Maybe," Coulter allowed, "but you saved me too. From a different kind of death, the slow kind, where you're breathing but not really living. So I'd say we're even." He held out his hand, and Ruby took it, marveling at how her small fingers disappeared into his calloused palm. Together they walked back to the celebration, where Raina was showing Evelina how she could spin without getting dizzy, and the ranch hands were arguing good-naturedly about whose riding skills were superior. Later that night, after the party had wound down and the guests had departed, Coulter carried an exhausted Reyna up to bed, while Ruby climbed the stairs on her own. Their room, and it was truly their room now, not just a place they were staying, had been transformed. New curtains hung at the windows. A bookshelf filled with volumes stood against one wall. Two identical quilts, clearly made by Evelina's skilled hands, covered their beds, but it was the item on Ruby's pillow that made her breath catch. A photograph in a simple wooden frame, faded and slightly creased, but clear enough to see the woman it depicted. She was young and beautiful, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding an infant wrapped in white linen. "That's Sarah," Coulter said quietly from the doorway. He'd settled Reyna into bed and now stood watching Ruby examine the photograph. "And that's our daughter, Clara. I thought you girls should know about them. They're part of this family's story too." Ruby traced the image with one finger. "She was beautiful." "She was," Coulter agreed. He came into the room and sat on the edge of Ruby's bed. "And she was kind and brave, and she had dreams for this ranch, dreams of it being filled with children and laughter and life. Dreams that died with her." "Until now," Ruby said softly. Coulter nodded. "Until now. I think she'd be happy knowing this house finally has the family she wanted for it, even if it's not the family we planned." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind Ruby's ear. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start teaching you girls the real work of ranching. No more easy rides on Silver. Time to learn how to cut cattle and rope calves and all the hard parts of this life." "We can do it," Ruby said confidently. "We're tough. We survived Eleanor and the trail and the wolves. We can handle anything." Coulter smiled, a real, genuine smile that made him look years younger. "I believe you can. Good night, daughter." "Good night, Papa." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Ruby set the photograph on the small table between the beds where both she and Reyna could see it, then changed into her nightgown and slipped under the covers. Across the room, Reyna was already asleep, one hand clutching her beloved rag doll. Ruby lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the eaves. Normal sounds, safe sounds, home sounds. She thought about everything that had brought them here, the loss of their father, Eleanor's cruelty, the terrifying night on the prairie. She thought about Coulter's scarred hands lifting them onto his horse, about Evelina's patient care, about the way the ranch hands had welcomed them without question. Most of all, she thought about the word the judge had used, family. Not by blood, though blood had brought her and Reyna into the world, but by choice. Coulter had chosen them. Evelina had chosen them. The ranch had chosen them. And they had chosen back. Ruby drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of tomorrow's riding lesson, of learning to be a real ranch hand, of all the days and years stretching ahead. For the first time in months, her dreams were free of wolves and cold and Eleanor's cruel eyes. Instead, she dreamed of horses running free across endless prairie, of Coulter teaching her to rope, of Reyna laughing as she helped Evelina in the kitchen. She dreamed of home. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass. Ruby woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, to the sound of Reyna already up and chattering excitedly with Evelina downstairs. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes that had been laid out for her, sturdy pants and a warm shirt, proper boots that fit her feet. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm and bustling. Evelina was at the stove, Reyna was setting the table, and Coulter was leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, looking more relaxed than Ruby had ever seen him. "There she is," he said when Ruby appeared. "Ready for a real day of work?" "Yes, sir," Ruby said. Then catching herself, "Yes, Papa." Something flickered in Coulter's eyes, pleasure, pride, maybe a touch of wonder that this was real. "Good. Eat up. We've got a full day ahead. Jericho's already got the horses saddled. Breakfast was hearty, eggs and bacon, fresh bread with butter and jam, milk still warm from the morning milking. Ruby ate until she was full, marveling at the abundance. Just weeks ago, she'd been starving. Now she had more food than she could finish. After breakfast, they headed out to the corrals where Jericho waited with 3 horses, Silver for Reyna, a bay gelding named Copper for Ruby, and Coulter's massive black stallion, Midnight. Time to graduate from walking lessons, Jericho announced. Today we're going to teach you how to actually work cattle. The morning passed in a blur of instruction. Ruby learned how to guide Copper with subtle pressure from her knees, how to anticipate a cow's movements, how to keep her seat when the horse made a sudden turn. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done before, and more than once she nearly fell. But every time she faltered, Coulter or Jericho was there with patient correction, and slowly, gradually, she began to understand. Raina struggled more, her smaller size making it difficult to control her horse when the cattle got stubborn. But she had determination in spades, and when a particularly ornery heifer tried to break from the herd and Raina successfully cut it off, blocking its escape, the entire crew erupted in cheers. "That's my girl," Coulter called out, pride clear in his voice. "Natural cow hand." They broke for lunch, sandwiches eaten sitting on the corral fence with the sun warm on their faces despite the autumn chill. Ruby's legs ached and her arms were sore, but she felt a deep satisfaction. She was learning. She was becoming part of this place. "You're doing well," Coulter told her quietly. "Both of you. Better than I expected, honestly. You've got good instincts." "Papa taught us," Ruby said. "Our first papa, I mean. He said Mama grew up on a farm, that she knew all about animals. Maybe we got that from her." Coulter nodded slowly. "Maybe so. Either way, you're naturals. Give it a few more months, and you'll be able to hold your own with any hand on this ranch." That afternoon, while Raina helped Evelina with baking, Coulter took Ruby on a ride around the property. They covered miles, him pointing out landmarks and boundaries, explaining how the ranch operated, sharing his vision for its future. "I want to expand the horse breeding program," he explained as they paused on a ridge overlooking a valley where several mares grazed with their foals. "We've got good bloodlines, and there's increasing demand for quality horses. But it takes time and careful planning." "Could we help?" Ruby asked. "With the horses?" Coulter glanced at her, surprised. "You'd want to?" "I love them," Ruby admitted. "The way they move, the way they think. It's like they're speaking a language we just have to learn to hear." "That's exactly right," Coulter said, and there was approval in his tone. "Most people never understand that about horses. They think it's all about dominance, about breaking their spirit. But the best horsemen know it's about partnership, about respect." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sarah used to say the same thing. She had a gift with horses, could gentle the wildest mustang with nothing but patience and kindness." He smiled faintly at the memory. "She would have liked you, Ruby. Both of you. She would have loved having daughters to teach." Ruby felt a lump form in her throat. Do you still miss her? Is it hard having us here when she's gone?" Coulter finished. "Yes, I still miss her, every day. But having you and Raina here, it doesn't hurt the way I thought it would. It's different. You're not replacements for Sarah and Clara. You're something new, something I didn't know I needed." He reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "Loss doesn't go away, Ruby. It becomes part of you. But so does love. And there's enough room in a heart for both, for remembering what was and embracing what is." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, arriving just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Raina met them at the barn, flower dusting her dress, her face glowing with excitement. "Evelina taught me to make bread," she announced. "Real bread, Papa, with yeast and everything. And she says tomorrow she'll teach me pies." "I look forward to tasting them," Coulter said solemnly, though his eyes danced with amusement. "Is that flour, or are you turning into a ghost?" Raina giggled and brushed at her dress, sending up small clouds of white powder. "It's harder than it looks, mixing dough. My arms got so tired." "That's what building strength feels like," Coulter told her. "Same as learning to ride or rope or any other skill. You push through the tired and eventually you get stronger." That evening, they ate Raina's bread with dinner, slightly lopsided but delicious, and Coulter made a great show of having 3 slices and declaring it the best bread he'd ever eaten. Raina beamed with pride, and even Evelina smiled her approval. After dinner, Coulter surprised them both by producing 2 small packages wrapped in brown paper. "I went into town last week," he explained. "Got these for you. Early welcome gifts, I suppose." Ruby opened hers carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of pencils. For writing, Coulter explained. Your thoughts, your stories, whatever you want, every person should have a place to keep their memories. Raina's package contained a small wooden box with a lock and key. Inside was lined with velvet, perfect for treasures. For important things, Coulter said. Things that matter to you. Raina immediately placed her rag doll inside, then added the carved horses Tommy had made. Ruby carefully set her journal and pencils in her new box, already thinking about what she would write. Maybe she'd record everything that had happened, from the wagon train to the courtroom, so she'd never forget how they'd gotten here. As they prepared for bed that night, Ruby paused at the window of their room, looking out over the ranch. Lantern light glowed from the bunkhouse where the hands were settling in. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. But this time, instead of fear, Ruby felt only a distant acknowledgement. The coyotes were out there, part of the prairie, but she was in here, safe and warm and home. Ruby? Raina's voice was soft. Do you think Mama and Papa, our first parents, do you think they'd be happy about us being here? Ruby thought about it carefully. I think Mama would be happy we're safe and loved. I think Papa would be happy we found someone strong and good to take care of us. She smiled at her sister, and I think they'd both be proud of how brave we've been. I hope so, Raina whispered. I don't want them to think we forgot them. We'll never forget them, Ruby promised. But we don't have to choose between remembering them and loving our new family. We can do both. It was a lesson she'd learned from Coulter, that hearts were bigger than anyone imagined, with room for old grief and new joy to exist side by side. Their first parents would always be part of them, would always hold a place in their memories and hearts. But Coulter and Evelina were part of them now too, building new memories, creating new love. The days began to blend into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for ranch work, riding, learning to care for the horses and cattle, understanding the endless tasks that kept a property running. Afternoons were for lessons with Evelina, who proved to be an excellent teacher with endless patience for their questions. Evenings were for family time, dinner together, stories by the fire, Coulter teaching them card games or reading aloud from books in the library. Ruby threw herself into learning everything she could about the ranch. She memorized the names of every horse, learned which cattle were prone to wander, studied the patterns of the seasons and how they affected the work. Jericho became her informal mentor, teaching her things Coulter didn't have time for: how to repair tack, how to read weather signs, how to handle the inevitable injuries and setbacks that came with ranch life. Raina, meanwhile, divided her time between the house and the barn. She had Evelina's gift for cooking and seemed to genuinely enjoy helping in the kitchen, but she also loved the animals and spent hours in the barn, talking to the horses, helping bottle feed orphaned calves, collecting eggs from the chickens. She's got a tender heart, Evelina observed one afternoon, watching Raina comfort a horse that had cut its leg on wire. She feels things deeply, the joy and the pain both. Is that bad? Ruby asked, worried. No, mija. It makes her compassionate. The world needs more of that. Evelina smiled. You're different from your sister in that way. You've got her heart, but you've also got steel in your spine. You're the protector. Ruby thought about that. It was true. She'd always felt responsible for Raina, had always been the one planning, watching for danger, making hard decisions. Even at 8 years old, she carried that weight. Is it wrong? She asked quietly. To always be worried? To always be waiting for something bad to happen? Not wrong, Evelina said gently. Just exhausting. And maybe, now that you're safe, you can learn to set that burden down sometimes. Let others do the protecting for a while. It was harder than it sounded. Ruby found herself waking at night, her heart pounding, certain she heard wolves or Eleanor's voice. She'd creep to the window and look out, reassuring herself that all was well, that they were still here, still safe. Sometimes she'd find Coulter standing on the porch below, keeping his own vigil, and she'd wonder if he struggled with the same fears. If he woke expecting to find them gone, this tentative happiness vanished like smoke. But slowly, gradually, the nightmares came less frequently. Ruby began to sleep through the night. The constant knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. She started to believe, really believe, that this was permanent, that they weren't going to be abandoned again. 6 weeks after the adoption, something shifted. Ruby and Raina had been at the ranch for almost 2 months by then, and autumn had given way to early winter. The first snow had fallen, transforming the prairie into a white wonderland that made Raina squeal with delight. They'd never seen snow before. Missouri winters had been mild, and the sight of the entire world covered in white was magical. Coulter and Jericho were teaching them to track in the snow, showing them how to read the stories animals left behind in their prints. They were examining what Jericho identified as deer tracks when one of the ranch hands came riding up fast, his horse breathing hard. "Boss, we got trouble at the north fence. Pack of wolves brought down one of the heifers, tore through the wire to get at her." Ruby felt Raina stiffen beside her. Coulter's expression went hard. "How many?" "At least 6, big ones, and they're not running, acting like they own the place." Coulter swore quietly. He looked at Ruby and Raina, saw the fear beginning to bloom on their faces, and his expression softened slightly. "Girls, go back to the house with Evelina. We'll handle this." "But," Ruby started, "no arguments. Wolves are dangerous, and you're not ready for this kind of work yet." His tone left no room for discussion. "Jericho, get the guns. Cal, round up 4 more men. We're hunting." As the men thundered off toward the north fence, Evelina appeared on the porch, having heard the commotion. She gathered both girls inside, but Ruby couldn't shake the fear coiling in her stomach. Those wolves, were they the same ones that had circled them that terrible night? Had they followed them here somehow? She knew it was irrational. Wolves didn't work that way. But trauma had its own logic, and hers was telling her that danger had found them again. The men were gone for hours. Evelina tried to distract them with baking, with stories, with anything she could think of, but Ruby couldn't focus. She kept imagining Coulter facing down a pack of wolves, kept seeing him lying bleeding in the snow. "Stop it," she told herself fiercely. "He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine." But the fear wouldn't release its grip. Finally, as afternoon faded toward evening, they heard horses returning. Ruby ran to the window and sagged with relief when she saw Coulter riding at the head of the group, whole and unharmed. Behind him, several horses carried the carcasses of wolves. The men dismounted, tired but satisfied. Ruby heard snatches of conversation. "Got the whole pack. Won't have trouble from them again. Need to reinforce that fence line." Coulter came in through the kitchen door, bringing cold air and the smell of gunpowder with him. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but he managed a reassuring smile when he saw Ruby and Raina waiting. "It's handled," he said simply. "The wolves are gone. They won't hurt anyone again." "Were you scared?" Raina asked, her voice small. Coulter considered the question seriously. "A little," he admitted. "Wolves are unpredictable, and there were a lot of them. But I had good men with me, and we all knew what we were doing." He knelt down to their level. "Are you two all right? I know hearing about the wolves must have been frightening. I thought," Ruby's voice cracked, "I thought maybe they'd hurt you, and then we'd be alone again, and—" "Hey!" Coulter pulled her into a fierce hug. "I'm fine. I'm not going anywhere. And even if something did happen to me, which it won't, you wouldn't be alone. You'd have Evelina and Jericho and all the hands. You'd have this whole ranch looking after you." "But we want you," Raina said, joining the embrace. "We don't want anyone else. We want you." Coulter's arms tightened around them both. "And I want you, more than I thought I could want anything again. You're stuck with me, girls, for better or worse, forever. I promise." It was the promise Ruby needed to hear. The promise that broke through the last of her fear and let her finally truly believe that this was real, that they were safe, that family meant more than blood. It meant choosing each other, again and again, even when things got hard. That night, after a quiet dinner and an early bedtime, Ruby lay awake listening to the house settle around her. She heard Coulter's footsteps moving through the downstairs, checking locks, banking the fire. She heard Evelina humming softly in her room down the hall. She heard Raina's even breathing from the next bed. And for the first time since their father died, Ruby felt completely at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more lessons, more work, the endless demands of ranch life. But they'd face it together, as a family. The orphans who'd been left to die on the trail had found their home, their purpose, their future. They'd found their papa, and he'd found his daughters. Winter settled over the Hayes Ranch with a quiet intensity that transformed the landscape into something otherworldly. Snow piled high against the barn walls, icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, and the cattle huddled together in the sheltered valleys where the wind couldn't reach them. The work became harder, more demanding, breaking ice on water troughs before dawn, hauling extra hay to the livestock, making sure no animal was left exposed to the brutal cold. Ruby and Raina learned what it meant to be ranch hands in winter. There were no days off when animals depended on you, no sleeping late when chores needed doing. They woke in darkness, dressed in layers of wool and leather, and trudged through snow that sometimes reached their knees. Their hands grew chapped and rough despite Evelina's salves. Their faces burned from wind and cold. But they never complained, not once, because this was their home, and these were their responsibilities. "Good work," Coulter told them one morning after they'd spent 2 hours helping him dig out a section of fence buried by a sudden blizzard. His breath came out in white clouds, and ice crystals clung to his beard. "You're tougher than half the men I've hired over the years." "We're Lockridge girls," Ruby said, then caught herself. "Hayes girls, I mean." "You're both," Coulter corrected gently. "You don't have to give up who you were to become who you are now. Your first parents gave you strength and courage. That's part of you forever." It was a small moment, but it meant everything to Ruby. She'd been struggling with the feeling that loving Coulter meant betraying her father's memory, that accepting this new family somehow diminished the one she'd lost. But Coulter understood, perhaps because he'd faced the same struggle with Sarah's memory. You could honor the past while embracing the present. You could carry old love while making room for new. Christmas came, and with it a revelation that left both girls speechless. They woke on Christmas morning to find the parlor transformed. A pine tree stood in the corner, decorated with candles and strings of popcorn and dried oranges. Packages wrapped in brown paper sat beneath it, more gifts than Ruby and Raina had ever received in their entire lives combined. "You did this?" Raina breathed, staring at Coulter with wide eyes. "For us?" "For all of us," Coulter corrected. He looked almost embarrassed, like he wasn't sure they'd appreciate the gesture. "It's been years since this house had a proper Christmas. Seemed like it was time." Evelina emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of hot chocolate, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "Open them," she urged, "before I burst from the suspense." There were warm coats lined with rabbit fur, sturdy winter boots that actually fit their feet, leather gloves soft as butter. There were books, dozens of them. Everything from adventure stories to histories to collections of poetry. There was a beautiful set of watercolors for Raina, who'd shown an interest in painting, and a telescope for Ruby, who spent hours staring at the night sky. But the gift that made Ruby's throat close with emotion was the last one Coulter handed her, a small wooden box that looked very old. When she opened it, she found a silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside were 2 tiny photographs. On one side, a man and woman Ruby recognized from her fading memories as her first parents. On the other side, a recent photograph of Coulter, Evelina, Ruby, and Raina together. "So you can keep them all close to your heart," Coulter said quietly. "All the people who love you." Ruby couldn't speak. She just threw her arms around his neck and held on tight while tears streamed down her face. Raina joined them a moment later, and then Evelina, until they were all tangled together in front of the Christmas tree, laughing and crying at the same time. "Thank you," Ruby finally managed. "Thank you for everything. For saving us. For keeping us. For making us yours." "Thank you for letting me be yours," Coulter replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given me more than you know." The ranch hands came by later that afternoon for Christmas dinner, a massive feast that Evelina had been preparing for days. The house filled with laughter, stories, the clatter of silverware, and the warmth of too many bodies packed into one space. Ruby watched it all with a sense of wonder, marveling at how far they'd come from that terrible night on the prairie. Jericho raised his glass in a toast. "To the Hayes family," he said, his deep voice carrying through the room. "May this be the first of many Christmases together, and may the happiness in this house never fade." "To family," everyone echoed, and Ruby felt the words settle into her bones like a blessing. But happiness, as Ruby was learning, was a fragile thing that required constant tending. 3 weeks after Christmas, trouble arrived in the form of a telegram from Cheyenne. Coulter read it at the breakfast table, his expression darkening with every line. "What is it?" Evelina asked, setting down her coffee cup. "Eleanor's filed an appeal," Coulter said flatly. "She's claiming the adoption was fraudulent, that she was coerced into giving up her rights, that the judge was biased. She wants custody reinstated." Ruby felt ice slide down her spine. "But she can't. The judge said a lot of things, but appeals are part of the legal process." Coulter's jaw was tight with barely controlled rage. "The hearing is in 2 weeks. We'll need to go back to Cheyenne and fight this." "From prison?" Raina's voice was small and frightened. "How can she appeal from prison?" "She found herself a lawyer," Coulter explained. "Someone willing to argue that the system failed her, that she deserves another chance. It's horseshit, but we have to take it seriously." "Coulter," Evelina warned, glancing at the girls. "Sorry." He rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking exhausted. "But the truth is, this could get ugly. Eleanor's lawyer is going to paint me as a wealthy rancher who stole 2 children, and her as a desperate woman who made a terrible mistake under duress. They're going to try to make this about class and privilege instead of about what she actually did." Ruby's hands clenched into fists. "That's not fair. She tried to kill us." "I know, sweetheart. I know." Coulter reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "But the law doesn't always care about fair. It cares about procedure and precedent and a dozen other things that have nothing to do with what's right. So we're going to need the best lawyer we can find, and we're going to need to be prepared for a fight." The next 2 weeks were tense. Coulter brought in a lawyer from Denver, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Walsh, who'd built her reputation defending children's rights. She spent hours interviewing Ruby and Raina, having them recount every detail of their abandonment, every moment of their time with Eleanor. "I need you to be strong," Catherine told them. "Eleanor's lawyer is going to try to discredit your testimony. He'll suggest you're too young to remember clearly, that you've been coached, that you're lying to stay with a rich man. You need to stick to the truth and don't let him rattle you." "We can do that," Ruby said firmly. Beside her, Raina nodded, though her face was pale. They traveled to Cheyenne on a bitterly cold January morning, the 5 of them packed into Coulter's largest carriage with heated bricks at their feet. The city was larger than Ruby remembered, full of noise and movement, and too many people pressed too close together. She held tight to Raina's hand as they made their way to the courthouse, feeling eyes on them from every direction. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been for the original hearing. Word had spread about the appeal, and apparently half the territory wanted to see what would happen. Ruby spotted familiar faces from the ranch. Jericho and Cal and Marcus had all made the journey to show support. But she also saw strangers, people whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to openly hostile. Eleanor was brought in wearing prison clothes, looking haggard but defiant. Her new lawyer, a slick man named Bartholomew Price, stood beside her with an air of smug confidence that made Ruby's skin crawl. Judge Carmichael entered, and the proceedings began. Price started with an opening statement that made Ruby's blood boil. He painted Eleanor as a victim, a widow overwhelmed by circumstances, a woman who'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of desperation, but who'd never stopped loving her stepdaughters. He claimed the abandonment had been a misunderstanding, that Eleanor had intended to come back for the girls, but had been prevented by circumstances beyond her control. "Mrs. Crane has shown genuine remorse," Price argued. "She's undergone counseling in prison. She's committed to becoming a better mother, and most importantly, she's the only blood family these children have left. To deny her the chance at redemption is to deny the very principles of justice and mercy upon which our society is built." It was masterfully done, Ruby had to admit. If she hadn't lived through Eleanor's cruelty, she might have almost believed it. Catherine Walsh stood to respond, and her voice was cold as winter steels. "Mr. Price would have us believe that abandoning 2 8-year-old girls in the wilderness without food or water was a mistake. That telling them the wolves could have them was a momentary lapse in judgment. That driving away while they screamed and begged for mercy was somehow excusable." She paused, letting the words sink in. This was not a mistake. It was attempted murder. And Eleanor Crane's only regret is that she was caught before she could profit from selling these children to mining camps. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Carmichael's gavel came down hard. "Order! I will have order in this court." The hearing dragged on for hours. Price called witnesses, people from the wagon train who testified that Eleanor had seemed like a devoted mother, that the girls had been difficult and ungrateful, that the stress of the trail had affected everyone's judgment. It was all carefully constructed lies and half-truths, but it was effective. Then Catherine called her witnesses. Horace, the wagon master, testified again about Eleanor's coldness toward the girls. Martha Simmons described watching Eleanor deliberately starve them while feeding herself well. Dr. Morrison took the stand and described the condition Ruby and Raina had been in when he first examined them: hypothermic, malnourished, covered in wounds. "In my professional opinion," Morrison said, "if Mr. Hayes hadn't found them when he did, those girls would have been dead within hours. This was not an act of desperation. It was calculated cruelty." Finally, it was Ruby's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, refusing to show the fear churning in her stomach. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then faced Price's cold smile. "Miss Lockridge," he began, his tone falsely friendly, "or should I say Miss Hayes, tell me, do you like living on Mr. Hayes's ranch?" "Yes, sir," Ruby answered. "I imagine it's quite different from life on the trail. Better food, warm bed, nice clothes." Price smiled. "Would you say Mr. Hayes is a wealthy man?" "Objection," Catherine said sharply. "Relevance. I'm establishing potential motivation for false testimony, Your Honor." Judge Carmichael considered. "I'll allow it, but get to the point, Mr. Price." "Miss Ruby," Price continued, "isn't it true that you were desperate when Mr. Hayes found you? That you would have said or done anything to secure a place in his home?" "We were desperate because Eleanor left us to die," Ruby said clearly. "And yes, we wanted to stay with Mr. Hayes. He was kind to us. He saved our lives." "Or perhaps," Price suggested, "your memories of Mrs. Crane have been colored by your current circumstances. Perhaps things weren't as bad as you claim. Perhaps Mrs. Crane did intend to come back for you, but Mr. Hayes convinced you otherwise." Ruby felt anger rising hot in her chest. "She told us the wolves could have us. She laughed when Raina cried. She hit my sister hard enough to split her lip. And then she drove away and never looked back. Those are the facts, Mr. Price. No amount of talking is going to change what happened." "A 8-year-old's interpretation of events?" Price said dismissively. "Children often misunderstand adult motivations." "I didn't misunderstand anything." Ruby's voice was steady and fierce. "Eleanor Crane tried to kill us because we were inconvenient, because her new husband didn't want to feed us, because she never loved us and never pretended to once our father was dead. If you want to give her another chance, fine, but give it to her with someone else's children, not us. We're not going back to her, ever." The courtroom was silent. Price looked like he wanted to argue further, but Catherine was already standing. "Your Honor, I think we've heard enough. Ruby Hayes has testified truthfully and consistently about her experiences. The defense would like to paint this as a child's misunderstanding, but the physical evidence supports everything she's said. These girls were abandoned, they were abused, they nearly died, and now the woman responsible wants them back so she can exploit them. This court cannot allow that to happen." Judge Carmichael studied Ruby for a long moment, then looked at Eleanor, who was staring at the table with a sullen expression. Finally, he turned to Raina. "Miss Raina, please approach the bench." Raina walked forward on shaking legs, and Ruby wanted desperately to go with her, to protect her from whatever was coming. But she forced herself to stay seated, to trust that her sister could handle this. "Miss Raina," the judge said gently, "I need you to tell me, in your own words, if you want to return to Mrs. Crane's custody." "No." Raina's voice was small but clear. "Never. She hurt us. She scared us. She left us to die. And if you make us go back to her—" Her voice broke. "If you make us go back, we'll run away. We'll disappear into the prairie, and you'll never find us. Because dying out there would be better than living with her." The judge's expression softened with something that looked like pain. "Thank you, Miss Raina. You may return to your seat." He was quiet for a long time after that, studying papers, making notes, his face unreadable. Ruby felt Coulter's hand settle on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, and she leaned into it gratefully. Finally, Judge Carmichael spoke. I've heard the arguments from both sides. I've reviewed the evidence, both from the original trial and from today's hearing, and I've listened very carefully to the testimony of Ruby and Raina Hayes, children who have shown remarkable courage and clarity in the face of circumstances no child should ever have to endure. He fixed Eleanor with a hard stare. Mrs. Crane, you had an opportunity to care for two vulnerable children. Instead, you treated them with cruelty and contempt. You starved them, you beat them, and finally you abandoned them in the wilderness with full knowledge that they would likely die. Your actions were not the result of momentary desperation. They were calculated, deliberate, and evil. Eleanor's face flushed with rage, but Price put a restraining hand on her arm. This court finds no merit whatsoever in your appeal, Carmichael continued. The original ruling stands. Your parental rights remain terminated, and the adoption by Coulter Hayes is valid and permanent. Furthermore, I'm adding an additional provision to your sentence. You are hereby forbidden from any contact with Ruby and Raina Hayes for the remainder of your natural life. If you attempt to circumvent this order, your sentence will be extended accordingly. His gavel came down with finality. This case is closed. The courtroom erupted. Ruby felt Raina crash into her arms, both of them crying with relief. Coulter pulled them both close, his own eyes shining with moisture. Catherine Walsh was shaking hands with people, accepting congratulations, but Ruby barely noticed. It was over. Truly, finally over. Eleanor was dragged from the courtroom screaming threats and curses, but her voice faded into nothing as the bailiffs hauled her away. Ruby watched her go and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just a hollow sense of closure. That woman had no power over them anymore. She never would again. They stayed in Cheyenne that night, at a hotel that felt impossibly luxurious after the tension of the hearing. Coulter ordered dinner sent up to their rooms, a feast that none of them had much appetite for, and they sat together in comfortable silence, processing what had happened. I'm proud of you both, Coulter finally said. You were braver in that courtroom than most adults I know. You stood up for yourselves and you told the truth, even when it was hard. That takes real courage. We had to, Ruby said quietly. If we hadn't, she might have won. She might have taken us back. She never would have, Coulter said firmly. If that judge had ruled in her favor, I would have left the territory with you, gone to California or Oregon or Mexico if necessary. I made you a promise that you'd never have to go back to her. I meant it. Ruby looked at him. This man who'd become her father, who'd shown them what real love and protection looked like, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for fighting for us, for keeping us safe. Always, Coulter promised. For as long as I live, you two will be safe. That's what fathers do. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, greeted by the entire crew who'd stayed behind. Word of the judge's ruling had already reached them via telegraph, and they'd organized an impromptu celebration in the barn. Someone had hung lanterns from the rafters. Someone else had brought out fiddles and guitars. There was dancing and laughter and more food than anyone could eat. To the Hayes girls, Jericho called out, raising a cup. Who proved that the truth matters more than fancy lawyers? To Coulter Hayes, Cal added, who reminded us all what it means to be a decent man. Ruby danced with Raina, with Evelina, with each of the ranch hands who asked. She spun until she was dizzy, laughed until her sides hurt, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, felt genuinely, completely happy. Later that night, as the party wound down and people began drifting back to the bunkhouse, Ruby found Coulter standing outside in the cold, staring up at the stars. Can't sleep? She asked, coming to stand beside him. Just thinking, he said, about how different things are now compared to a year ago, how empty this place felt, how empty I felt. And now? Now it feels like a home again. He looked down at her and his smile was genuine. You and Raina, you brought light back into this house, into my life. I don't think I ever thanked you properly for that. You saved us, Ruby pointed out. I think that makes us even. Maybe, Coulter allowed. Or maybe we saved each other. Maybe that's what family does. Saves each other, over and over, in 100 different ways. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, but its voice held no threat now, just the music of the prairie at night. The rest of winter passed more peacefully. With the threat of Eleanor finally, truly eliminated, the household settled into an even deeper rhythm of contentment. Ruby and Raina threw themselves into ranch life with renewed energy. They'd lost so much time to fear and uncertainty, and now they wanted to make up for it. Ruby proved to have a natural talent for working with horses. She spent hours in the barn with Jericho, learning the subtle art of training, understanding that it was about communication rather than domination. By March, Coulter trusted her to work with the younger horses, teaching them to accept saddles and bridles. "You've got your mother's gift," he told her one afternoon, watching her gentle a skittish colt. "Sarah could calm any horse, no matter how wild. You have that same patience." It was the first time he'd compared Ruby to Sarah without pain shadowing his eyes, and Ruby understood what that meant. He was healing, they all were. Raina had found her own calling in the kitchen with Evelina, but she also showed an unexpected aptitude for the financial side of ranching. She had a head for numbers that surprised everyone, including herself. Coulter started teaching her bookkeeping, showing her how to track expenses and income, how to plan for lean seasons. "She's sharp," he told Ruby one evening, "sharper than I was at her age. If she keeps developing this skill, she could run the business side of this ranch one day." The thought filled Ruby with pride. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. They were becoming the people they were meant to be, developing skills and dreams and futures. Spring arrived with a rush of green that transformed the prairie overnight. Wildflowers bloomed in riotous colors. Calves were born, filling the pastures with their awkward, endearing presence. The ranch hands worked dawn to dusk, and Ruby and Raina worked right alongside them, earning the respect of every man there through sheer determination and grit. On Ruby's 9th birthday, April 3rd, a date that had almost been forgotten in the chaos of the previous year, Coulter woke her before dawn. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "I have something to show you." She dressed quickly and followed him out into the pre-dawn darkness. He led her to the barn, where a young mare stood in one of the stalls, a beautiful chestnut with a white blaze down her face and intelligent eyes that studied Ruby with interest. "She's yours," Coulter said simply, "if you want her. She's 2 years old, mostly trained, but she needs someone to finish her education, someone patient and kind, someone like you." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. "Mine? Really mine? Really yours. Her name's Sunset. At least that's what the breeder called her. But you can change it if you want." Ruby approached the mare slowly, letting her sniff her hand, reading her body language. The horse was curious but cautious, much like Ruby herself. "Sunset's perfect," she said softly. "She's perfect, Papa. Thank you." She spent the entire day with her new horse, getting to know her personality, beginning the slow process of building trust. By evening, Sunset was following her around the corral like a loyal dog, and Ruby was so happy she thought her heart might burst. Raina's birthday gift came 2 weeks later, not a horse, but something equally precious. Coulter presented her with a beautiful leather journal, its cover tooled with intricate designs, its pages filled with columns and lines for keeping accounts. "For tracking our business," he explained. "You'll be my official bookkeeper from now on. Real responsibility, real work. You'll help me make decisions about what to buy and sell, when to expand, how to budget. Think you can handle it?" "Yes!" Raina hugged the journal to her chest like it was made of gold. "I won't let you down, Papa. I promise." "I know you won't," Coulter said, ruffling her hair. "You're a Hayes girl. Hayes girls don't fail." That summer was the best of Ruby's young life. She rode Sunset every day, exploring the vast reaches of the ranch, learning every valley and creek and hill. She helped with roundups, sitting in the saddle for 12 hours at a stretch, pushing cattle to new pastures. Her hands developed calluses, her skin turned brown from the sun, and she felt herself growing stronger with every passing day. Raina thrived too, her bookkeeping becoming essential to the ranch's operation. She caught errors Coulter had missed, suggested cost-saving measures that actually worked, and generally proved herself indispensable. Evelina taught her more advanced cooking, and soon Raina was producing meals that had the ranch hands fighting for second helpings. In July, something unexpected happened. A family arrived at the ranch. Homesteaders who'd gotten lost trying to find the main trail north. They had 3 children, including a girl about Ruby's age named Sarah. For 2 days, while Coulter helped them repair their wagon and resupply, Ruby and Sarah became fast friends. "You're so lucky," Sarah said wistfully as they sat on the corral fence watching the horses. "Living here, having all this space, learning to do real work. We're just going to some tiny farm in Montana where I'll probably spend the rest of my life churning butter and mending clothes." "You could stay," Ruby suggested impulsively. "There's always room for more hands on a ranch this size. I bet Papa would hire your father." But Sarah shook her head. "My father's got his heart set on his own land. Says he won't work for another man, not even a good one." She smiled sadly. "But thanks for being my friend, even if it's just for a little while. I haven't had a real friend in years." "Me neither," Ruby admitted. "Not since, well, not for a long time." When Sarah's family left, Ruby felt a pang of loneliness. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed having someone her own age to talk to, someone who understood what it was like to be a girl in this rough world. But the feeling passed quickly, soothed by the steady rhythms of ranch life and the solid presence of her family. By autumn, as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp, Ruby realized something profound. A full year had passed since that terrible night on the prairie, 12 months since Coulter had found them clinging to life in the rocks. One full cycle of seasons as Hayes girls. She stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the prairie, and marveled at how different everything was. A year ago, she'd been certain she was going to die. Now she was here, healthy and strong and loved, with a future stretching out before her like the endless Wyoming sky. Thinking deep thoughts again? Coulter appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one. He'd started letting her have coffee at dinner, claiming she'd earned it through her hard work. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Ruby said. "How different we are now." "Different how?" Ruby considered. "Stronger, braver, more sure of ourselves." She looked up at him. "Happier." "Yeah," Coulter agreed softly. "We are that." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I never thought I'd feel this way again. After Sarah died, I was convinced that part of my life was over, that I'd spend the rest of my days alone, just going through the motions." He smiled. "Thank you for proving me wrong." "Thank you for not riding past us that night," Ruby replied. "Thank you for stopping, for caring, for choosing us." "Best decision I ever made," Coulter said firmly. Then, with a slight smile, "Even if you two have turned my quiet ranch into a circus of activity," Ruby laughed. "You love it." "I do," he admitted. "More than I thought possible." They stood together watching the stars emerge, father and daughter, bound not by blood but by something stronger, choice and love, and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Behind them, through the lighted windows, Ruby could see Raina helping Evelina with dishes, both of them laughing at something. This was family, Ruby thought. Not perfect, not without its challenges, but real and solid and true. They'd all been broken in different ways, had all lost people they loved, had all faced darkness that should have destroyed them. But instead of letting that darkness win, they'd found each other. They'd built something new from the ruins of their old lives. And maybe that was what survival really meant, not just enduring, but growing. Not just living, but thriving. Not just remembering the past, but building a future worth living for. Ruby took a sip of her coffee and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new adventures. But tonight, standing here with her papa under the Wyoming stars, surrounded by the life they'd built together, she felt completely at peace. They'd made it. Against all odds, despite everything that had tried to break them, they'd made it. And they were home. The peace Ruby had felt that autumn evening lasted exactly 3 weeks. It shattered on a cold October morning when a rider came thundering up to the ranch house, his horse lathered with sweat and his face pale with urgency. Ruby was in the barn helping Jericho repair a broken stall door when she heard the commotion, Coulter's raised voice, the ranch hands gathering in the yard, a tension in the air that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "What's happening?" she asked Jericho, who dropped his tools and was striding toward the house. "Stay here," he ordered. But Ruby had never been good at following orders when her family might be in danger. She ran after him, arriving just in time to hear the messenger deliver his news. "Fire at the Morrison place," the man was saying, his words tumbling over each other. "Spread from the barn to the house before they could stop it." Doc Morrison got his wife out, but he went back in for something. Papers, medicine, I don't know. And the roof came down. He's trapped inside, and the fire's too hot for anyone to get close. Coulter was already moving, shouting orders. "Jericho, get every man mounted. Bring shovels, blankets, anything we can use to fight fire. Cal, hitch up the water wagon. Marcus, ride ahead and see if you can organize a bucket line from the creek." "Papa," Ruby started, but he was already running toward the barn. Within minutes, the ranch erupted into organized chaos. Men saddled horses at a dead run, loaded supplies onto wagons, checked their gear with the efficient movements of people who'd trained for emergencies. Ruby stood frozen, watching it all, until she felt a hand on her shoulder. "Come inside," Evelina said gently. "There's nothing we can do here except stay out of their way." "But Dr. Morrison," Ruby's voice cracked. Doctor. Morrison had been kind to them, had checked on them weekly during those first fragile months. The thought of him trapped in a burning building made her feel sick. "Your father will do everything he can," Evelina assured her. "Now come. We need to prepare. They'll bring injured people back here. We need bandages, salves, clean water. We need to be ready to help." The waiting was excruciating. Ruby and Reyna worked alongside Evelina, tearing sheets into strips, boiling water, laying out Evelina's medical supplies in neat rows on the kitchen table. But every few minutes, Ruby found herself at the window, staring down the road toward the Morrison Ranch, watching for signs of smoke or returning riders. It was late afternoon when they finally came back. Ruby saw Coulter first, his face blackened with soot, his clothes scorched and torn. Behind him, a wagon carried what looked like bodies covered in blankets, and Ruby's heart seized with terror. She ran outside, Reyna at her heels. "Papa, did you—" Coulter dismounted heavily, swaying with exhaustion. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from smoke or tears Ruby couldn't tell. "We got him out," he said hoarsely, "but he's hurt bad. Burns on his arms and back, smoke in his lungs. He needs help, and the nearest real doctor is 2 days away." Mrs. Morrison was already being carried into the house, sobbing and calling her husband's name. Dr. Morrison followed on a stretcher, his face gray with pain, his breathing labored and wet-sounding. The smell of burned flesh made Ruby gag, but she forced herself to stay steady. "What can we do?" she asked Coulter. "Pray," he said simply. "And help Evelina however you can. She's the closest thing to a doctor we've got right now." The next 3 days were a nightmare of vigil and worry. Dr. Morrison lay in one of the guest rooms, drifting in and out of consciousness, his wife at his side refusing to leave. Evelina worked tirelessly, cleaning his wounds, changing bandages, dosing him with willow bark tea for pain and fever. But everyone could see he was failing. The burns were too extensive, the smoke damage too severe. Ruby helped where she could, fetching water, holding the doctor's hand when he thrashed with fever dreams, sitting with Mrs. Morrison when the woman needed someone to talk to or simply cry with. She learned things during those long hours, learned that mortality was arbitrary and cruel, that good people suffered just as much as bad ones, that life could be snatched away in an instant despite everyone's best efforts. On the 4th morning, Dr. Morrison woke with unusual clarity. His eyes, though sunken and pained, were focused. He asked to speak with Coulter privately, and when Coulter emerged from the room 20 minutes later, his expression was grave. "He wants to see you girls," Coulter told Ruby and Reyna. "He doesn't have much time left. He wants to say goodbye." Ruby's throat closed, but she nodded. She took Reyna's hand and they walked together into the dim room where death waited patiently in the corner. Dr. Morrison smiled when he saw them, a weak, painful smile, but genuine. "There are my brave girls," he whispered. "Come closer. Let me see you properly." They approached the bed, and Ruby was shocked by how much he'd deteriorated in just a few days. The vital, energetic man who'd examined them so carefully after their rescue had become a frail shadow. "I wanted to tell you," Morrison continued, his voice barely audible, "how proud I am of you both. When I first saw you, I didn't think you'd make it through the week. But look at you now, strong, healthy, full of life. You're survivors, you two. Never forget that. You're going to survive too, Raina said desperately. You have to. You're the doctor. You help people. Not this time, little one. Morrison's hand trembled as he reached out to touch her cheek. Sometimes even doctors can't fix what's broken. But that's all right. I've had a good life. I've helped a lot of people. And seeing you girls thrive, that's a good way to end things. Knowing I played a small part in your story. It wasn't small, Ruby managed past the lump in her throat. You saved us just as much as Papa did. You made sure we healed right. You gave us a chance. Then my work is complete. Morrison's eyes drifted closed. Take care of each other. Take care of your father. He needs you more than he knows. Those were the last words he spoke. He slipped away an hour later with his wife holding one hand and Coulter holding the other. The ranch fell silent with grief, not just for Morrison, but for what his death represented. Mortality had come calling, reminding them all that safety was an illusion, that tragedy could strike at any moment regardless of how careful they were. They buried Dr. Morrison on a hill overlooking his property, under a sky so blue it seemed mocking. Half the territory came to the funeral, patients he'd treated, families he'd helped, people whose lives he'd touched. Ruby stood between Coulter and Raina, listening to the preacher talk about a good man gone too soon, and felt anger mixing with her grief. It wasn't fair. Dr. Morrison had been kind and generous and skilled. He'd deserved more time. Life isn't fair, Coulter said that evening, as if reading her thoughts. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, something that had become their ritual. Good people die young. Bad people sometimes live to old age. There's no justice in it, no sense. It just is. Then what's the point? Ruby asked bitterly. What's the point of being good if you just end up dying anyway? Coulter was quiet for a long moment. The point, he finally said, is what you leave behind, Doctor. Morrison died saving medical records, information about patients that would have been lost otherwise. He died trying to preserve his life's work. That means something. And all the people he helped, all the lives he saved, including yours, that legacy continues. He's gone, but the good he did remains. It's still not fair, Ruby insisted. No, Coulter agreed. It's not. But we don't get to choose when we die. We only get to choose how we live. And Morrison lived well. That's what I'm trying to do too. Live in a way that matters so that when my time comes, I'll have left something worthwhile behind. He looked at Ruby, and his expression was serious. You and Raina, you're what I'm leaving behind, my legacy. Not just the ranch or the money, but the people you'll become, the good you'll do in the world. That's what makes all of this worthwhile. Ruby leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and some of her anger ebbed. Dr. Morrison was gone, but the kindness he'd shown them lived on. The care he'd provided had given them the chance to become who they were meant to be. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Mrs. Morrison moved to Denver to live with her sister, unable to bear staying in the place where her husband had died. Before she left, she came to the Hayes Ranch to say goodbye. Thank you, she told Coulter, gripping his hands tightly, for everything you tried to do, for giving him a chance, for being there at the end. She turned to Ruby and Raina. And thank you girls for sitting with me, for listening to my stories about him. It helped more than you know. Will you be all right? Raina asked, her eyes worried. Mrs. Morrison's smile was sad but real. Eventually. Grief doesn't end, but it changes. It becomes something you carry rather than something that crushes you. At least that's what people tell me. I suppose I'll find out if they're right. After she left, the ranch felt subdued for weeks. Everyone moved through their tasks mechanically, the joy gone from even simple pleasures. Ruby threw herself into work with sunset, riding for hours, pushing both horse and rider to exhaustion. It was easier than thinking, easier than feeling. But life, as Coulter had said, went on whether they wanted it to or not. November brought the first serious snow, and with it, the desperate work of protecting the herd from the elements. They lost 3 calves to the cold despite everyone's best efforts, and Coulter spent an entire night in the barn with a cow having a difficult birth, finally delivering a stillborn calf at dawn. This is ranching, Jericho told Ruby when he found her crying in the tack room after helping dispose of the dead calf. Birth and death all mixed together. You save the ones you can and mourn the ones you can't, but you keep going. The living depend on you. How do you stand it? Ruby asked. Rubitis. How do you keep caring when you know things will die anyway? Because caring matters, Jericho said simply. That calf died, but it had a fighting chance because we tried. The 3 we lost to cold, they would have died faster and harder if we hadn't done everything we could. We don't get to control outcomes, Ruby. We only get to control our effort. And our effort has to be everything, every time, because that's what the animals deserve. That's what life deserves. It was a hard lesson, but Ruby was starting to understand it. Life on the ranch was teaching her things no book could, about responsibility, about sacrifice, about the weight of caring for creatures that depended on you completely. It was teaching her that love always came with the risk of loss, but that the love was worth it anyway. Christmas came again, but this year it was quieter, tinged with awareness of their mortality and fragility. They didn't have a big party, just family dinner with Evelina and the core ranch hands who'd become like uncles. They exchanged simple gifts and told stories about people they'd lost, honoring memory instead of running from it. To Dr. Morrison, Coulter said, raising his glass. A good man who died too soon. To Dr. Morrison, everyone echoed, and Ruby felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. Grief was part of love, she was learning. You couldn't have one without risking the other. Winter deepened, bringing weeks where the temperature never rose above freezing, where the wind cut like knives and the snow piled so high that the ranch hands had to dig tunnels from the bunkhouse to the barn. Ruby and Raina continued their lessons with Evelina, but they also spent hours helping with the endless work of winter, feeding animals, breaking ice, shoveling paths, checking on isolated cattle in the far pastures. It was during one of these checks, in late January, that trouble found them again. Ruby was riding with Coulter and Cal, checking the herd in the North Valley, when they spotted riders on the horizon. 6 men on horseback, moving with purpose toward the haze boundary. Coulter's hand immediately went to his rifle. Stay behind me, he ordered. Cal, circle around. If things go bad, get Ruby back to the house. I'm not leaving you, Ruby protested, but Coulter's look silenced her. The riders approached, and Ruby's blood ran cold when she recognized the man in front. Silas Crane, Eleanor's husband, supposedly serving time alongside her. But here he was, free and armed and radiating menace. Well, well, Silas drawled, pulling his horse to a stop 20 feet away. If it ain't the mighty Coulter Hayes and his stolen daughter. You're supposed to be in prison, Coulter said flatly. I'm guessing you broke out, which means the law's already looking for you. Best turn yourself in before this gets worse. Silas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Prison's for fools who get caught, and I ain't planning on getting caught. See, I got business to settle first. Business with you. We have no business, Coulter said. You need to leave my property. Now. Your property, Silas spat into the snow. Built on the backs of men like me who break our bodies for a few dollars while rich bastards like you sit in your fancy houses counting money. Eleanor told me all about this place, about how you stole those brats and bought yourself a judge, about how you ruined our lives. Eleanor tried to murder 2 children, Coulter said, his voice deadly calm. I saved them. That's not theft. That's justice. Your justice cost me a wife and a future, Silas snarled. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me $10,000 in gold, and then me and my boys are going to ride away, and you'll never see us again. Refuse, and his eyes shifted to Ruby, and the threat in them was explicit. Well, accidents happen on ranches, especially to little girls. Ruby felt ice slide down her spine. Beside her, Coulter had gone utterly still in a way that was somehow more frightening than rage. You just threatened my daughter, he said softly. In front of witnesses. On my land. He raised his rifle in one smooth motion. You have 5 seconds to turn around and ride away. After that, I start shooting. For a moment, tension crackled in the frozen air. Silas's hand moved toward his gun, and Ruby was certain violence was about to erupt. But then one of the other men spoke up, his voice nervous. Boss, there's more riders coming. Lot of them. Everyone turned to see a group of horsemen cresting the ridge behind them. Jericho at the front, with at least a dozen ranch hands fanned out behind him, all armed. They must have seen the confrontation from the house and come running. Silas's face twisted with rage, but he was smart enough to recognize impossible odds. "This ain't over, Hayes, you hear me? This ain't over." "Yes, it is," Jericho called out. "Marshal's already been telegraphed. Every lawman in the territory's looking for you now. You got maybe a day before they catch you. Spend it running or spend it dying. Your choice." For a long moment, Silas looked like he might try anyway, might go for his gun despite the odds. But finally he wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop. His men followed, disappearing into the trees at the valley's edge. Ruby realized she was shaking. Coulter holstered his rifle and pulled her close, his arms tight around her. "It's all right," he murmured. "He's gone. You're safe." "He threatened me," Ruby said, her voice small. "He looked at me like I was already dead." "He'll be the one dead if he ever comes back here," Coulter said grimly. "Jericho, double the watch. I want armed men patrolling day and night until Silas is caught. Nobody goes anywhere alone, and get word to the marshal. Tell him Silas Crane made direct threats against my family. I want him hunted down and put back in chains." The ride back to the ranch felt endless. Ruby couldn't shake the memory of Silas's eyes, the cold promise of violence in them. When they finally reached the house, Evelina took one look at Ruby's face and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "What happened?" Coulter explained while Ruby stood frozen, unable to speak. She felt Raina's hand slip into hers, heard her sister's frightened breathing. They'd been safe for so long, had finally let their guard down. Now danger had found them again, and Ruby felt all the old fears flooding back. That night, neither Ruby nor Raina could sleep. They huddled together in Ruby's bed, listening to the sounds of the house, Coulter's boots on the floorboards as he paced, the murmur of voices as he and Jericho discussed security, the creak of someone checking the locks for the 10th time. "I thought we were done being scared," Raina whispered. "I thought we were finally safe." "We are safe," Ruby said with more confidence than she felt. "Papa won't let anything happen to us. Neither will Jericho or any of the hands. We're protected." "But what if—" "No what-ifs," Ruby interrupted firmly. "We can't live in fear, Raina. Dr. Morrison taught us that. We can't control what happens, but we can control how we respond. We stay strong. We stay together. We trust Papa to handle this." It was easier said than done. The next week passed in a state of heightened alert. The ranch hands took turns on watch, rifles always within reach. Ruby and Raina weren't allowed outside without an armed escort. Every sudden sound made Ruby's heart race. Every shadow seemed to hide threats. But Coulter remained steady, a rock they could all lean on. He went about his work with calm efficiency, never showing fear, even though Ruby knew he must be feeling it. At night, he read to them from adventure novels, his deep voice steady and soothing, reminding them that heroes faced danger and overcame it. "You're teaching us to be brave," Ruby said one evening as he closed the book. "I'm teaching you that bravery isn't the absence of fear," Coulter corrected. "It's acting despite fear, doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. That's real courage, Ruby. And you've already shown more of it than most adults I know." "I don't feel brave," Ruby admitted. "I feel scared all the time now." "That's because you're smart enough to recognize real danger," Coulter said. "But watch. You'll keep getting up every morning. You'll keep doing your chores, riding Sunset, helping with the ranch. You'll keep living despite the fear. That's bravery. That's what it means to be strong." The break came on the 8th day. The marshal arrived with a telegram. Silas and his men had been caught trying to cross into Montana. There'd been a shootout. 2 of Silas's men were dead. Silas himself had been wounded and was now in custody, facing enough charges to guarantee he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. "He's done," the marshal said. "No appeals, no escape, no second chances. Between the prison break, the attempted extortion, and firing on lawmen, he'll hang or rot, one or the other." The relief that swept through the household was almost physical. Ruby felt like she could breathe properly for the first time in days. Raina cried from sheer release of tension. Even Coulter seemed to deflate slightly, the rigid control he'd maintained finally relaxing. "It's really over?" Ruby asked. "Both of them," Eleanor and Silas? They can't hurt us anymore? It's really over, Coulter confirmed. They're done. Finished. You never have to worry about them again. That night, for the first time in a week, Ruby slept through to morning. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of Evelina's coffee, and felt something settle in her chest. Peace. Real, lasting peace. The rest of winter passed without incident. Spring arrived with its usual burst of activity, calving season, new foals, repairs to buildings damaged by winter storms. Ruby threw herself back into work with renewed energy, feeling like she'd been given a second chance at the life she'd been building. By the time her 10th birthday arrived in April, she'd grown 3 inches and gained muscle that came from hard physical labor. She could rope a calf, brand cattle, assist with difficult births, and ride as well as any hand on the ranch. Coulter watched her work with obvious pride, and Ruby felt herself standing taller under his approval. "You're becoming quite the cowgirl," he told her on her birthday, presenting her with custom-made saddle with her initials tooled into the leather. "Thought you deserved proper equipment for all the proper work you do." Ruby traced the letters, RH, Ruby Hayes, and felt emotion swell in her chest. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you, Papa." "Thank you," Coulter replied, "for being exactly who you are, for surviving everything that tried to break you, for becoming this strong, capable, amazing person." His voice roughened. "I'm proud to be your father, Ruby. Every single day." Ruby hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and horses and home. They'd been through so much, abandonment, grief, loss, threat after threat, but they'd survived it all. They'd more than survived. They'd thrived. And as Ruby stood there in her father's arms, surrounded by the life they'd built together, she finally understood what Coulter had been trying to teach her. Courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about facing fear and choosing love anyway. It was about building something good despite knowing it could be lost. It was about getting up every morning and deciding that life, messy, dangerous, unpredictable life, was worth living with everything you had. They'd been given a second chance, all of them, and they weren't going to waste it. The years that followed Ruby's 10th birthday seemed to pass both quickly and slowly, each season bringing its own rhythms and lessons. The ranch flourished under Coulter's careful management and Raina's increasingly sophisticated bookkeeping. The herd grew from 200 head to nearly 500. The horse breeding program that Ruby had helped develop began producing animals known throughout the territory for their intelligence and stamina. The Hayes Ranch became synonymous with quality, integrity, and the kind of success that came from honest work and careful planning. Ruby grew into her role as Coulter's right hand in the day-to-day operations. By 12, she could evaluate a horse's conformation with an expert eye, negotiate prices with buyers who underestimated her because of her age and gender, and manage a crew of ranch hands twice her size. She wore her authority naturally, never demanding respect but earning it through competence and fairness. The men who'd watched her arrive as a starving, traumatized 8-year-old now took orders from her without question. Raina's path was different, but equally impressive. Her gift for numbers evolved into a sophisticated understanding of markets, investments, and business strategy. At 11, she convinced Coulter to diversify their income by contracting with the Army to supply horses, a decision that tripled their annual profits. At 13, she was managing the ranch's finances with a skill that made bankers from Cheyenne seek her advice. Where Ruby commanded respect through action, Raina earned it through brilliance. "You've raised remarkable daughters," visitors often told Coulter, and he'd smile with unmistakable pride. "They raised themselves," he'd reply. "I just gave them room to grow." But it wasn't entirely true, and everyone knew it. Coulter had given them more than room. He'd given them safety, structure, education, and most importantly, unwavering belief in their potential. He'd shown them what a father should be: present, supportive, firm when necessary, but never cruel, willing to let them fail and learn, but always there to catch them if they fell too far. The bond between them deepened with each passing year. Ruby and Coulter developed a shorthand communication that needed few words. A glance across the breakfast table could convey an entire conversation about the day's priorities. Raina and Coulter spent long evenings poring over ledgers together, her quick mind complementing his experience. their discussions about ranch business evolving into philosophical conversations about life, purpose, and legacy. Evelina watched it all with quiet satisfaction, her role evolving from housekeeper to something more like a grandmother. She taught the girls everything she knew about running a household, about healing, about the hundreds of small skills that turned a house into a home. More importantly, she taught them about resilience, about finding joy in simple things, about the kind of quiet strength that sustained people through long, difficult years. "You've made something beautiful here," she told Coulter one evening as they watched Ruby and Raina race horses across the south pasture, their laughter carrying on the wind. "Sarah would be proud of what you've built, of who you've become." "I hope so," Coulter said quietly. "I think about her often, about what she'd say about all this, about the girls." "She'd say you did well," Evelina assured him. "She'd say you honored her memory by opening your heart again instead of closing it forever. That takes courage, Coulter, real courage." It was true that Coulter had changed in the years since finding Ruby and Raina. The hardness that had encased him after Sarah's death had softened, worn away by daily doses of laughter and purpose, and the simple act of being needed. He smiled more easily now. His eyes held warmth instead of just pain. He'd learned to live again instead of merely existing, and everyone who knew him recognized the transformation. But transformation wasn't without its challenges. As Ruby and Raina entered their teenage years, new complications arose. Ruby at 14 was as comfortable in a saddle as on her own feet, more at ease with horses and cattle than with people her own age. She had few friends outside the ranch, and the ones she did have were mostly the daughters of neighboring ranchers, girls who understood the demands of this life, but who often seemed frivolous and silly to Ruby's serious nature. "You need to spend more time with people your age," Coulter told her one morning, after she'd turned down yet another invitation to a social gathering in town. "You're becoming isolated, Ruby. That's not healthy." "I'm not isolated," Ruby protested. "I have Raina. I have you and Evelina and all the hands. That's plenty of people." "That's family and employees," Coulter pointed out. "You need friends, Ruby. People you can talk to about things that matter to you. People who aren't part of the ranch." "The ranch is what matters to me," Ruby said stubbornly. "Everything else feels like a waste of time." Coulter studied her with concern. He recognized what was happening. Ruby was using work as a shield, throwing herself into ranch responsibilities to avoid the vulnerability that came with forming new relationships. She'd been abandoned once, nearly died from it, and some part of her was still protecting against that possibility by keeping everyone except her core family at arm's length. "Ruby," he said gently, "I understand why you're doing this. I did the same thing after Sarah died, buried myself in work, avoided people, convinced myself I didn't need anyone. But that's not living. That's just surviving, and you deserve more than survival." "I'm fine," Ruby insisted, but her voice wavered slightly. "You're lonely," Coulter corrected, "and you're scared of getting hurt again. But isolation doesn't protect you, sweetheart. It just makes the world smaller and smaller until you're trapped in it." Ruby wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the words, because he was right. She was lonely. She watched Raina form friendships easily, saw her sister laugh and gossip with the town girls who came to socials, and felt a pang of something that might have been envy. But the thought of opening herself up like that, of trusting people outside her immediate family, felt impossible. "What if they leave?" she finally asked, her voice small. "What if I let someone in and they just go away? Like Papa did. Like Eleanor was supposed to, but didn't until she tried to kill us. Everyone leaves eventually." "Not everyone," Coulter said firmly. "I'm still here. Raina's still here. Evelina, Jericho, all the people who matter, we're still here. And yes, someday that will change because that's life. But the time we have together, the connections we make, those are worth the risk of loss. They have to be, or what's the point of any of it?" It was a conversation that stayed with Ruby for weeks. She thought about it while working with the horses, while riding fence lines, while lying awake at night listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. And slowly, reluctantly, she began to see his point. She was building walls that were supposed to protect her, but were actually just making her world smaller. So she started saying yes. Yes to the church social, where she spent an awkward but not terrible afternoon with girls who wanted to talk about boys and fashion. Yes to helping the new school teacher organize books for the one-room schoolhouse, even though Ruby had long since outgrown its curriculum. Yes to joining Raina and Evelina for shopping trips to town, even though she found shopping tedious. It wasn't easy. Ruby's natural reserve and serious demeanor often put people off. She had little patience for small talk, no interest in the topics that seemed to obstinate other girls her age, and a directness that some found off-putting. But gradually, she found a few people who appreciated her for who she was. The blacksmith's daughter who wanted to learn metalworking, the banker's son who shared her love of horses, the widow Thompson who ran the general store and had a dry wit that matched Ruby's own. "See?" Coulter said when Ruby came home from town one afternoon, actually smiling about something the widow Thompson had said. "The world's not so terrible once you let it in a little." "Don't get used to it," Ruby warned, but she was teasing. "I'm still more comfortable with horses than people." "That's fine," Coulter assured her, "as long as you remember that people matter too. The connections matter, that letting yourself care about others and letting them care about you is what makes life worth living." While Ruby was learning to open up, Raina was facing her own challenges. At 13, she'd developed into a striking young woman with sharp intelligence that intimidated many of the boys her age. She had suitors, sons of wealthy ranchers and businessmen who saw her beauty and Coulter's wealth and thought they'd found an easy mark. They quickly learned otherwise. "He asked me to marry him," Raina announced one evening at dinner, her tone conveying exactly what she thought of the proposal. "Thomas Hartwell said we could combine our family's ranches and build an empire." "What did you tell him?" Coulter asked, trying to keep the amusement out of his voice. "I told him I'm 13 years old, and if he asks me again, I'll have Jericho shoot him." Raina stabbed her potato with unnecessary force. "Why do boys assume every girl wants to get married and have babies? Some of us have other plans." "What are your plans?" Ruby asked curiously. Raina's face lit up with passion. "I want to study business. Real business, at a university. And then I want to come back here and make the Hayes Ranch the most successful operation in the entire West. I want to prove that women can run enterprises as well as men, better, even." Coulter set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "That's ambitious." "Is that a problem?" Raina's chin came up defensively. "Not at all," Coulter said. "I'm just thinking about logistics. There aren't many universities that accept women, and the ones that do are mostly back east. You'd be gone for years." The implications of that statement hung in the air. Raina's face fell as she realized what she'd be giving up. Not just the ranch she loved, but the family that had saved her, the only real home she'd ever known. "Maybe it's a stupid idea," she said quietly. "Maybe I should just—" "It's not stupid," Ruby interrupted. "It's brilliant. And you should do it, Raina. You should go learn everything you can and then come back and show everyone what you're capable of." "But that means leaving you, leaving Papa and Evelina, leaving all of this." Raina's voice cracked. "I don't know if I can do that." Coulter reached across the table and took her hand. "Listen to me, both of you. Family isn't about staying in one place forever. It's about knowing you have people who love you no matter where you go or what you do. If Raina wants to go to university, she should go. We'll miss her like crazy, but we'll be here when she comes home. And she will come home. This is her place, her legacy. Nothing can change that." "You mean it?" Raina asked, tears shining in her eyes. "You wouldn't be angry if I left?" "I'd be angry if you didn't follow your dreams because you were afraid," Coulter said firmly. "You've got a gift, Raina, a real talent for business that could take you anywhere, let you accomplish anything. Don't waste it trying to play it safe. Take the risk. Chase the dream. We'll be right here cheering you on." That conversation changed something fundamental in their household. It made explicit what had always been implicit, that Coulter's love wasn't conditional on the girls staying with him forever, that he wanted them to grow and thrive even if it meant leaving, that family bonds were strong enough to survive distance. But distance was still years away. For now, there was the daily work of running the ranch, of managing the thousands of details that kept a successful operation functioning. There were cattle drives and horse sales, negotiations with buyers and confrontations with weather. There were births and deaths, celebrations and setbacks, the endless cycle of ranch life turning with the seasons. Ruby found herself taking on more responsibility as Coulter began to step back slightly, trusting her judgment in situations that would have required his direct intervention years earlier. At 15, she represented the Hayes Ranch at regional cattlemen's meetings, the only woman in rooms full of weathered men who initially dismissed her and quickly learned not to. Her reputation grew. The Hayes girl who could outride most men, who knew horses like they were speaking to her, who negotiated with steel beneath her soft voice. "You're more like your father every day," Jericho told her after she'd successfully mediated a dispute between two hands that could have escalated into violence. "Got his way of seeing to the heart of things, his fairness." "He's taught me well," Ruby said simply, but inside she glowed with pride. Being compared to Coulter felt like the highest compliment anyone could pay her. The summer Ruby turned 16, everything changed in a way none of them expected. A family arrived at the ranch in July, travelers whose wagon had broken down on the main road. Coulter immediately offered hospitality, as he always did, inviting them to stay until repairs could be made. The family consisted of parents, 2 young children, and their eldest son, a young man of 18 named Daniel Prescott. Daniel was tall and lean, with sun-streaked hair, an easy smile that made people like him instantly. He was educated, having spent 2 years at university before his family's fortunes reversed, and they'd been forced to head west seeking new opportunities. He was well-spoken, hardworking, and unfailingly polite. He was also clearly fascinated by Ruby. "I've never met anyone like you," he told her on the 3rd day of his family's stay, watching her work with a particularly difficult mare. "Most girls I know are terrified of horses this size." "Most girls you know probably haven't grown up on a ranch," Ruby pointed out, not looking away from the mare. "Horses are just animals. They're not scary if you understand them." "You make it look easy," Daniel observed. "But I've been watching the other hands work with her. They use force and intimidation. You use, I don't know what to call it, conversation?" Ruby smiled despite herself. "That's actually a good word for it. Horses communicate constantly. You just have to learn their language." They talked for hours that afternoon, and Ruby found herself enjoying Daniel's company in a way that surprised her. He asked intelligent questions, actually listened to her answers, and treated her expertise with respect instead of condescension. When she talked about her dreams of expanding the horse breeding program, he offered thoughtful suggestions instead of dismissing them as impractical. "You should be careful," Raina teased that evening after Daniel and his family had retired to the guest house. "You actually smiled at him, multiple times. I'm not sure I've ever seen you smile at a boy before." "Don't be ridiculous," Ruby said, but she felt her cheeks heat. "I was just being polite to a guest." "Uh-huh." Raina's grin was knowing. "Polite, sure. That's why you spent 4 hours showing him around the ranch instead of doing your actual work." Ruby threw a pillow at her sister, but she couldn't quite suppress her own smile. The truth was, she did like Daniel. He was different from the boys who'd tried to court her before, less impressed by her father's wealth, more interested in her as a person. When he looked at her, he seemed to see Ruby the individual, not just Ruby the Hayes heiress. The Prescott family's repairs took a week, and during that time, Ruby and Daniel spent increasingly more time together. He helped her with her work, proving himself surprisingly capable despite his lack of ranch experience. They rode out to check fence lines together, sat on the porch in the evenings talking about books and ideas, discovered a shared love of stargazing. Coulter watched it all with mixed feelings. He liked Daniel. The young man was respectful, hardworking, clearly intelligent. But watching Ruby open up to someone outside the family, seeing her laugh and blush and show sides of herself she usually kept hidden, made Coulter acutely aware that his daughter was growing up. That someday, probably sooner than he wanted, she'd build a life that didn't revolve entirely around the ranch and him. "She's happy," Evelina said, finding him on the porch one evening watching Ruby and Daniel walk toward the barn. "Let her be happy, Coulter." "I am," Coulter protested. "I want her to be happy. He stopped, struggling for words. "I'm not ready to lose her yet." "You're not losing her," Evelina said gently. "She's just growing. That's what children do. And you've raised her well enough that she'll make good choices. Trust her." "I do trust her," Coulter said. "It's the rest of the world I'm not sure about." But when the Prescott family finally left, their wagon repaired, supplied with provisions from the Hayes stores, Daniel asked permission to write to Ruby. He did so formally, addressing Coulter directly, acknowledging that Ruby was young and that any correspondence would be purely friendship with an eye towards something more in the future if both parties remained interested. He did that right, Jericho commented after Daniel's departure. Showed respect. Didn't try to sneak around or manipulate. That says something about his character. It does, Coulter agreed. Doesn't mean I have to like the idea of some boy courting my daughter, but at least he's doing it properly. Ruby and Daniel exchanged letters throughout the fall and winter. His family had settled in Colorado, where his father had found work managing a small ranch. Daniel wrote about his life there, asked thoughtful questions about the Hayes operation, shared his own dreams of someday having land of his own. Ruby responded with careful honesty, telling him about her work, her ambitions, her fierce love for this life she'd built. He wants to visit in the spring, Ruby told Coulter in March, her voice carefully casual. His letter says he'd like to see the ranch during calving season, learn more about our operation, and, she hesitated, and see me. He was very clear about that part. Coulter studied his daughter, seeing the young woman she'd become, strong, capable, certain of herself in ways that had nothing to do with any boy's approval, but also seeing the hope in her eyes, the vulnerability of someone opening her heart for the first time. Tell him he's welcome, Coulter said. But Ruby, be careful. I'm not saying Daniel isn't a good man. He seems to be. But you're 16 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't rush into anything just because it feels right in the moment. I won't, Ruby promised. I know who I am, Papa. I know what matters to me. If Daniel and if this becomes something, it'll be because we both want the same things, not because I'm trying to fill some void or because I think I need someone to complete me. Coulter pulled her into a hug, marveling at her wisdom. When did you get so smart? I had a good teacher, Ruby said against his shoulder. You showed me what real love looks like, the kind that doesn't demand or control, that lets people be who they are. Whatever happens with Daniel or anyone else, I'll never settle for less than that. Daniel visited in April, and over the course of 2 weeks, he proved himself to everyone at the ranch. He worked from dawn to dusk during the busiest time of the year, never complaining, never shirking the dirty or difficult tasks. He deferred to the experienced hands, but wasn't afraid to ask questions or offer suggestions. And he treated Ruby with a respect and affection that even Coulter couldn't find fault with. He's good for her, Evelina observed. Makes her laugh. Doesn't try to change her or make her into something she's not. Just appreciates who she is. I know, Coulter admitted. Doesn't mean I have to like it. But he did like it, even if he wasn't quite ready to admit it. He liked seeing Ruby happy in a way that had nothing to do with horses or cattle or ranch business. He liked watching her discover this new part of herself, the part that could be both a rancher and a young woman, that didn't have to choose between strength and softness. When Daniel left at the end of his visit, he asked Coulter for permission to court Ruby officially. She's 16, Coulter said carefully. Still young, and she's got responsibilities here that she takes seriously. I know, Daniel said. I'm not asking her to give any of that up. I'm just asking for the chance to be part of her life while she's building it, to support her dreams, not replace them. And what are your intentions? Coulter asked bluntly. Long term? Daniel didn't hesitate. Eventually, marriage. But not for years. Not until Ruby's ready, until we're both established enough to build a life together. I have nothing to offer her right now except myself and my commitment, but I'm working to change that. My father's teaching me everything he knows about ranch management. I'm saving every dollar I can. Someday I want to be able to offer Ruby a real partnership, not her supporting me, but us building something together. It was the right answer, and Coulter knew it. You have my permission to court her, but Daniel, his voice hardened. If you hurt her, if you treat her with anything less than the respect and devotion she deserves, you'll answer to me. Understood? Understood, Daniel said seriously. And Mr. Hayes, thank you for trusting me with her. I know what she means to you. I'll do everything I can to be worthy of that trust. The courtship proceeded slowly, carefully, with both Ruby and Daniel taking their time. They exchanged weekly letters. Daniel visited twice more that year, each time working alongside the ranch hands and spending his evenings talking with Ruby about everything and nothing. They discussed books and philosophy, debated politics and religion, shared their fears and dreams and the quiet vulnerabilities they showed no one else. "I love him," Ruby told Raina one night, her voice full of wonder. "I didn't mean to, didn't plan to, but I do. Is that crazy?" "It's not crazy," Raina assured her. "It's just life. Messy, unpredictable, beautiful life." Ruby was 17 when Daniel proposed, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but quietly, during a ride out to their favorite overlook, where the entire ranch spread out below them like a promise. "I don't have much to offer yet," he said, holding her hands in his. "My father's promised me a piece of his land to start my own operation, but it'll be years before it's anything more than a small ranch." "Nothing like this." He gestured at the Hayes property stretching to the horizon. "But I can offer you partnership, respect, a life built together instead of you supporting me or me trying to control you, and I can promise that I'll love you every day exactly as you are, for as long as we both live." "Yes," Ruby said simply. She didn't need grand gestures either. She needed this. Honesty, partnership, someone who saw her completely and loved what he saw. "Yes, I'll marry you." They told Coulter that evening, both of them nervous despite their certainty. Ruby watched her father's face carefully, saw the play of emotions, sadness at the thought of her leaving, pride in who she'd become, reluctant acceptance that this was right. "You're sure?" he asked Ruby. "This is what you want?" "It is," Ruby confirmed. "I love him, Papa, and I trust him. He's not asking me to give up who I am or what I care about. He wants to build something with me, not instead of me." Coulter turned to Daniel. "She's my daughter in every way that matters. Losing her, even to a good man." His voice caught. "It's harder than I expected." "You're not losing her," Daniel said quietly. "The ranch will always be part of Ruby's life. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to learn from you, to understand how you've built something so successful, so I can hopefully build something half as good." It was the right thing to say. Coulter pulled Ruby into a tight embrace, then extended his hand to Daniel. "Welcome to the family, son. Take care of her. And know that you've got big boots to fill. She's gotten used to being treated like she walks on water." "She does walk on water," Daniel said simply. "That's why I love her." The wedding was planned for the following summer, giving Daniel time to establish himself and Ruby time to train someone to take over some of her responsibilities at the Hayes Ranch. Because she wasn't leaving entirely, that was never in question. The plan was for Daniel and Ruby to build their own ranch nearby, close enough that Ruby could still be involved with the Hayes operation while also building something new with her husband. "Best of both worlds," Raina said approvingly. "You get your partnership with Daniel, but you don't lose your connection to home." The year leading up to the wedding was bittersweet. Ruby threw herself into preparation, not just for the wedding itself, but for the life that would follow. She worked longer hours, determined to document everything she knew so it could be passed on. She trained Cal's younger brother Marcus to take over much of her horse work, teaching him everything Jericho had taught her years ago. And she spent time with Coulter, long rides and longer conversations where they talked about everything they'd been through together. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruby asked one evening. "Taking us in? Your life would have been simpler if you'd just ridden past that night." "Simpler," Coulter agreed, "but emptier. Ruby, you and Raina, you saved my life as much as I saved yours. You gave me purpose again. You reminded me what it means to love and be loved. Regret it?" He shook his head firmly. "Never, not for a single second." "Even when we were difficult?" Ruby teased. "When Raina set the kitchen on fire trying to cook, when I fell off midnight and broke my arm, when—" "Especially then," Coulter interrupted, "because that's what family is. The difficult moments and the easy ones, all tangled together. The fights and the laughter, the fear and the joy. You don't get to pick and choose. You take it all, and you're grateful for every second." Ruby leaned against his shoulder, this man who'd been father, teacher, protector, and friend. "I hope I can be half the parent to my children that you've been to us." "You'll be even better," Coulter said with certainty, "because you'll have the advantage of starting from a place of love instead of grief. Your children will never doubt they're wanted. That's a gift beyond measure." The wedding took place on a perfect June day with half the territory in attendance. Ruby wore a simple but elegant dress that Evelina had spent months creating, white silk with delicate embroidery that caught the light. Raina stood beside her as maid of honor, radiant in blue, while Daniel's brother served as best man. But it was Coulter walking Ruby down the aisle that made everyone reach for handkerchiefs. He moved slowly, as if reluctant to reach their destination, and when the preacher asked who gave this woman in marriage, his voice was rough with emotion. "I do. Her sister and I do. And her mother, watching from heaven, does as well." He kissed Ruby's forehead, shook Daniel's hand with a grip that conveyed both blessing and warning, and stepped back. Ruby and Daniel exchanged vows, promises of partnership, respect, love through all seasons of life. And when they kissed as husband and wife, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers. The celebration lasted until dawn, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Jericho gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry. Raina spoke about sisterhood and love and the bonds that survived any distance. And Coulter, when called upon, simply raised his glass and said, "To family, born, chosen, and built, may we never forget how precious it is." Ruby and Daniel left the next morning for Colorado to begin building their life together, but not before Ruby made one final stop. She rode Sunset up to the rocky outcrop where Coulter had found her and Raina all those years ago, the place where they'd huddled in terror, certain they were going to die. She stood there for a long moment, looking out over the prairie that had nearly killed them, and felt the weight of everything that had happened since. The fear and grief, the healing and growth, the love that had saved them all. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, to the land, to whatever forces had aligned to bring Coulter riding past at exactly the right moment. "Thank you for the second chance, for the family, for all of it." Then she turned Sunset toward home, toward her new home, but also toward the place that would always be home, the ranch and the people who'd shown her what family really meant. Life continued its rhythm at the Hayes Ranch. Raina left for university 2 years later, pursuing her dream of business education with Coulter's full support and financial backing. She wrote weekly, her letters full of excitement about her studies and determination to make her mark. She came home for summers and holidays, each time bringing new ideas and strategies that she and Coulter would implement together. Ruby and Daniel built their ranch from nothing into something respectable, proving that the lessons she'd learned from Coulter had taken deep root. They had their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Eleanor, honoring both of Ruby's mothers, when Ruby was 20. 2 more children followed, a son they called James after Ruby's first father, and another daughter named Evelina. The families remained intertwined, visiting frequently, the children growing up knowing that the Hayes Ranch was as much their heritage as their parents' smaller operation. Coulter became papa to a whole new generation, teaching Ruby's children the same lessons he'd taught her, about horses and cattle, about integrity and hard work, about the kind of love that saves lives. When Raina finished university, she returned home as promised and took over the business operations of the Hayes Ranch entirely. With her sophisticated management and Ruby's continued involvement in the breeding program, the ranch grew to be one of the most successful in the entire West. People came from hundreds of miles away to buy Hayes horses and to learn from the women who'd proven that gender was no barrier to excellence. "We did it," Raina said one evening, standing with Ruby and Coulter on the porch where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. "Look at what we built. The 3 of us together." "The 4 of us," Coulter corrected, glancing at the window where Evelina was visible in the kitchen, still cooking even though she was now well into her 70s. "None of this would have been possible without her." "The 4 of us, then," Raina agreed. She was 25 now, had received multiple marriage proposals but turned them all down, claiming she was too busy building an empire to bother with romance. Ruby suspected the truth was different, that Raina simply hadn't met anyone who saw her as an equal rather than a prize to be won. But she'd find that person eventually, or she wouldn't, and either way she'd be fine. The Hayes girls had learned long ago that they didn't need anyone else to be complete. Coulter was in his 50s now, silver threading through his dark hair, lines deepening around his eyes. But he was still strong, still active, still the center around which the ranch revolved. He'd lived long enough to see his daughters not just survive but thrive, to see them become the amazing women he'd always known they would be. "Do you remember?" Ruby said quietly. That night you found us. Do you remember what we looked like? Every detail, Coulter confirmed. Two little girls, barely alive, clinging to each other in the rocks. I thought, his voice caught, I thought you were already dead when I first saw you, and then you opened your eyes and looked at me, and I knew I couldn't leave you. I couldn't ride away. Thank you for not riding away, Ruby said, as she had so many times over the years. Thank you for stopping, for caring, for choosing us. Thank you for letting me, Coulter replied, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for becoming my daughters, for giving me a reason to live again. He pulled them both close, these women who'd been children when he found them, who'd become the greatest accomplishment of his life. I love you both, more than I could ever put into words. We love you too, Papa, they said together, and in that moment, standing on the porch of the house that had become home, surrounded by the life they'd built together, everything was complete. The story that had begun in terror and abandonment had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to resilience, to the power of chosen family, to the truth that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Two orphaned girls and a grieving cowboy had found each other in the darkness and had built something that would last for generations. Years later, when Coulter was old and his health failing, Ruby and Raina sat on either side of his bed, holding his hands just as they'd held each other's hands that terrible night on the prairie. Tell us again, Raina asked softly. Tell us about the night you found us. Coulter's voice was weak but clear. I was riding home from town. Late, darker than it should have been. I almost didn't go that way, almost took the shorter route. But something pulled me toward the rocks. And there you were, two tiny figures, holding each other like you could keep the world away through sheer determination. What did you think when you saw us? Ruby asked, though she'd heard this story dozens of times. I thought you were the bravest people I'd ever seen, Coulter said simply. Children who'd been abandoned and left to die, but who were still fighting, still refusing to give up. I thought, if they can be that strong, maybe I can be strong too. Maybe I can open my heart one more time. And did you? Raina asked through her tears. Open your heart. Wider than I ever imagined possible, Coulter confirmed. You two, you filled all the empty places. You made me whole again, gave me purpose and joy and love. You made my life matter. You made our lives possible, Ruby whispered. Everything we are, everything we've become. It started with you stopping that night, with you choosing not to ride away. Coulter smiled, his eyes drifting closed. Best decision I ever made, he murmured. My daughters. My beautiful, strong, amazing daughters. I'm so proud of you both, so grateful for every moment. He slipped away peacefully that night, surrounded by the family he'd built. Ruby and Raina at his bedside, Evelina holding his other hand, his grandchildren waiting in the next room. His last words were about love, about gratitude, about the miracle of second chances. They buried him next to Sarah and Clara on the hill overlooking the ranch he'd built into something legendary. The entire territory came to the funeral, ranchers and businessmen, politicians and neighbors, all the lives he'd touched through his quiet integrity and unwavering decency. But it was Ruby's eulogy that everyone remembered. Standing at her father's grave, she spoke not about his success or his wealth, but about his heart. My father saved my life twice, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. Once when he pulled me from the rocks where I was dying, and once when he showed me what love really meant, not the conditional kind that demands and controls, but the kind that lifts up and supports and believes. He taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about showing up every day and choosing to care, to sacrifice, to love even when it's hard. She looked at Raina standing beside her, then at her own children, then at the assembled crowd. My father's legacy isn't this ranch, though it's impressive. It's not his wealth or his reputation, though both are considerable. His legacy is the lives he changed through simple kindness. Two orphaned girls who became his daughters, a housekeeper who became family, ranch hands who became brothers, a community that learned from his example what it means to be truly good. Her voice broke slightly. We were dying when he found us, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. He didn't just save our lives, he gave us new ones, better ones, And now it's our responsibility to carry forward what he taught us, to live with integrity, to love without reservation, to never ride past someone who needs help. The words echoed across the prairie, carried by the same wind that had whispered through the grass on that long ago night when everything changed. And standing there, saying goodbye to the man who'd been her salvation and her father, Ruby felt the circle complete itself. They'd all saved each other, she realized. Coulter had saved them from death. They'd saved him from grief. And together, they'd built something that would outlast them all, a legacy of love, of resilience, of family, forged not in biology but in choice and courage, an unwavering commitment. The Hayes Ranch continued to thrive under Ruby and Raina's combined leadership, growing into the empire they'd always dreamed of. Ruby's children grew up learning the same lessons their mother had, becoming the fourth generation to understand that strength came in many forms and that family was built through love rather than accident of birth. On the anniversary of that terrible night, the night Ruby and Raina had been abandoned to die, they made it a tradition to ride out to the rocks where Coulter had found them. They'd stand there together, looking out over the land that had tried to kill them and had instead become their home. And they'd remember. They'd remember the terror and the cold, the certainty of death. They'd remember the sound of hoofbeats in the darkness, the rough warmth of a stranger's coat, the moment when hope returned. They'd remember every lesson, every laugh, every tear, every triumph. And they'd be grateful. Grateful for second chances, grateful for chosen family, grateful for a lonely cowboy who'd ridden toward trouble instead of away from it, who'd opened his broken heart one more time and given two dying girls the chance to become who they were always meant to be. The story of the twin orphans left to die on the trail until a hardened cowboy claimed them as his own became legend in Wyoming, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for Ruby and Raina, it was never a story. It was their life, their truth, their foundation, and it was everything that mattered. On quiet evenings, when Ruby's grandchildren asked her to tell them about their great-grandfather, she'd take them up to that same porch where she'd spent so many hours with Coulter. She'd point to the same stars that had watched over two terrified little girls and the man who'd saved them, and she'd begin. Once upon a time, there were two sisters who were lost in the darkness. They were cold and scared and certain they were going to die. But then a cowboy appeared on the horizon. And the story would begin again, passed down through generations, a reminder that love could find you in the darkest places, that family was built through choice, and that sometimes the most important decision you could make was simply to stop, to care, to open your heart despite every reason not to choose love, even when it scared you, especially when it scared you, because in the end, that's what saved them all.